Fraud, cover-ups, a nation shamed, a Sherpa blamed for a disaster that wasn't his fault, and climbers who found out, too late, that the people supposed to keep them alive had already decided to look the other way. Every one of these stories is documented, and every one of them should have been stopped before it started. Here's what they didn't want you to know. It's June 5th, 2016. A married couple walks into a press conference glowing with exhaustion and pride. They've just become the first Indian couple to summit Mount Everest together. The summit photos were stunning, a historic achievement. Every major newspaper in India ran their story. There was just one problem. Everything was perfect, too perfect. And sometimes, when something seems too good to be true, it's because it is. And what happened next would expose a problem that goes much deeper than one couple's ambition. A problem that reveals what we've really turned the world's most sacred mountain into. From climbers who summited on a day the mountain was closed, to a motivational speaker who built a 4-year career on 29,000 feet of lies. These are the biggest Everest lies ever caught on camera. Welcome to the extreme edge. So check this out. On June 5th, 2016, Dinesh and Tarakeshwari Rathod were gleaming with pride. This married couple of 8 years had just accomplished something incredible. They had become the first Indian couple to summit Mount Everest together. This achievement was a long time coming. They both passionately loved each other as much as they loved climbing. I know that sounds pretty extreme, but Dinesh and Tarakeshwari weren't just random people with a death wish. They were police constables in Maharashtra, India, respected members of their community, people with real careers and real responsibilities, and they had been climbing together for years. In fact, back in 2014, they had claimed to conquer something called the Aussie 10, which meant climbing the 10 highest peaks in Australia. It's a brutal challenge that either brings couples closer together or completely destroys their relationship. After all, there's really no middle ground when you're suffering together on a mountain. When they came back from Australia claiming success, the local media went crazy and celebrated them as heroes. They were the talk of their town. But it wasn't enough. They wanted to stake their superiority on the highest them. It was like this sacred vow. It became sort of an obsession. In fact, they wanted to do this so much that they literally decided they would never bring a child into this world until they conquered the tallest mountain on Earth together. For 2 years after Australia, they saved every rupee they could. They trained relentlessly, and in the spring of 2016, they finally made their attempt on the world's highest mountain. So when Dinesh stood up at the official press conference in Kathmandu, Nepal, holding these summit photos, his voice was literally shaking with emotion. He said, "We were committed that we would not give birth to a child until we climb Mount Everest. With pride now, we want to become parents." The entire press conference erupted in applause. The media went absolutely crazy. Back home in India, they were being hailed as heroes. Front page news, television interviews. Everything was perfect, except for one tiny little problem. The photos they were showing everyone were completely fake. So, there's this software engineer in Bangalore named Satyarup Siddhanta. He's just casually scrolling through news articles about Everest climbs when he sees the Rathod's summit photos plastered all over the Indian news, and his jaw literally drops to the floor. Because those weren't their photos, they were his photos from when he climbed Everest just 2 days earlier on May 19th. Can you imagine? You risk your life climbing the world's tallest mountain, achieving something for yourself, feeling proud and accomplished, and even more confident in your abilities than ever. You take these incredible summit photos as a reminder of what you're capable of, maybe to look at them when you're feeling down. And then, a few days later, you're watching TV and seeing those exact same photos with different people's faces pasted over yours. So Satyarup does what any normal person would do in 2016. He absolutely blows up on Facebook. He posts, "This is so amazing. They took my pics and photoshopped their image of the summit and got certificates too. Shame on you, officers from Pune." And that one Facebook post completely upended their lives. Now, here's what makes the whole thing frankly ridiculous to me. After Satyarop's comments, experts started investigating his claims. When mountaineering experts started looking at these photos more closely, they found mistakes that were so obvious, it's honestly embarrassing. In one photo, Tara Kashwari is wearing red climbing boots. In another photo, supposedly taken just minutes later on the same summit, she's wearing completely different yellow boots. If you wonder why that's a big deal, let me ask you something. Have you ever climbed a mountain? I haven't climbed Everest, but I'm pretty sure when you're 29,000 feet up, gasping for air in the death zone, and every step could literally kill you, you're not stopping to change your shoes for a better Instagram photo. But wait, it gets worse. Their jackets were also changing colors between photos. Their oxygen masks are appearing and disappearing like magic tricks. And here's the really damning part. The shadows and lighting are identical in every single different photo they took of their climb. It's like they didn't even try to make it believable. They just took Satyarop's photos, poorly photoshopped their faces over his, and called it a day. But here's what's really crazy about this whole situation. The Nepal Department of Tourism, whose actual job is to verify Everest summits, just took a look at these obviously fake photos and said, "Yep, looks legit," and gave them official certificates. Now, before you wonder how something so obvious could slip past officials, there is some context worth mentioning. Nepal, especially back then, wasn't exactly a tech powerhouse. In 2011, barely 9% of the population even had internet access. So when it came to checking summit photos or spotting fakes, the system just wasn't built for it. But what really gets me is just how bold their lie was. The Rathods claimed they reached the summit at 6:25 a.m. local time. But mountaineering experts pointed out that based on the height and angle of the sun in their stolen photos, it was clearly around 11 a.m. or noon. It's like claiming you took a photo at midnight while the sun is clearly shining bright in the background. And here's another red flag that somehow everyone missed initially. When investigators tried to track down the Sherpa guides, who supposedly led them to the summit, Furba and Fursemba, these guys had mysteriously vanished. They couldn't be reached for questioning. They had just disappeared into thin air. Other climbers who were actually on the summit that morning confirmed that no one else was there when the Rathods claimed to have reached the top. The summit was empty except for the legitimate climbers. Nepal officially launched an investigation, but it was a short one. The evidence was way too overwhelming. Photos that don't match, Sherpa guides who don't exist, timing that makes no sense. And on August 30th, 2016, they got slapped with a 10-year climbing ban from Nepal. And that's not even the worst part. Remember, these people were police officers. They wore uniforms. They served their community. They were supposed to be examples of integrity and honesty. So when the Maharashtra police found out that their employees had become international symbols of fraud, they did what you'd expect. They launched their own investigation. And in August 2017, more than a year after their fake summit, they fired them. Both of them. Additional Commissioner Sahibrao Patil told the media that the couple had shared misleading information and brought disrepute to the Maharashtra Police Department. These two people risked their entire careers, their reputations, their futures, all for some fake photos that a software engineer, the original owner, spotted in a few seconds of casual web browsing. But here's what's really wild about this story. The Rathods weren't the only ones pulling this kind of stunt. In fact, this was just the beginning. Roughly 3 years later, on May 26, 2019, 3 climbers from small villages in India were about to attempt one of the most audacious claims in Everest history. Their names were Vikas Rana, Shobha Banwala, and Ankush Kasana. Now, these weren't wealthy adventure tourists flying in from Mumbai or Delhi. These weren't professional climbers with sponsorship deals. They were from 3 tiny rural villages where nothing exciting ever happens. Shobha was only 21 years old. For these 3 kids, an Everest summit wouldn't just be a personal achievement, it would literally transform their entire family's social status forever. They had scraped together every rupee they could find for this expedition. Everything they had was thrown into this one desperate shot at glory. Now, here's where things get interesting. Their plan seemed pretty simple. Make it partway up Everest, then claimed they reached the summit when there were no other climbers around to contradict their story. What could go wrong? As it turns out, everything. So, on May 26, 2019, they made their big announcement. They claimed they had reached the summit of Mount Everest along with 4 Sherpa guides, and they were the only people who had made it to the top that day. Back home in their villages, the celebration was absolutely incredible. The local newspapers ran stories with their photos. Politicians were lining up for photo opportunities. Their families were crying tears of joy and posting about it on every social media platform they could find. For a few beautiful days, these 3 kids from nowhere were the most famous people in their entire region. There was just one teeny tiny problem with their story. According to official expedition records, no one summited Everest on May 26, 2019. Not a single person. The mountain was basically closed due to high winds that would have made a summit attempt completely suicidal. But somehow, these 3 amateur climbers and their 4 mystery Sherpas had managed to conquer the mountain when experienced expedition teams with decades of experience had been forced to turn back for their own safety. So naturally, journalists start asking some pretty basic questions. And this is where everything falls apart in the most spectacular way possible. A reporter asks them what should have been a softball question. What were the names of your 4 Sherpa guides? Now, keep in mind, these are supposedly the people who risked their lives to get them to the summit, the experienced mountain guides who made their dream possible, the heroes who navigated them through the death zone and kept them alive in conditions that kill people regularly. You would think that after spending around 2 months on the world's most dangerous mountain with these 4 people, you might remember their names, or at least their nicknames, or something. The 3 climbers look at each other like deer caught in headlights. There's this awkward silence that goes on way too long. And finally, 21-year-old Shoba quietly admits, we don't know their names. Not even a nickname like the tall one or the guy with the beard. Nothing. But it gets even better, or should I say worse. When reporters ask to see their summit photos, they refuse to reveal them. They claim the photos exist, but they won't show them to anyone. Not the media, not Nepal's Department of Tourism, not even their own families who are throwing celebration parties based on their supposed achievement. Meanwhile, their expedition company, Prestige Adventures, is telling a completely different story. Managing director Damber Parajuli is basically throwing them under the bus, saying these 3 climbers never even made it close to the summit. He's telling investigators that they turned back at Camp 3, which sits at about 23,000 feet. Now, that's still really high, but it's more than 6,000 feet below the actual summit of Everest. And here's the final nail in the coffin. Another climber named Chiring Sherpa, who was at base camp that day, says he saw all 3 of them just hanging out there around 12:30 in the afternoon on their supposed summit day. If these 3 had actually summited that morning, they should have been somewhere around 25,000 feet, slowly making their way down through the death zone, not sitting around base camp having dal bhat. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Nepal's Department of Tourism started demanding proof. They wanted photos, videos, GPS data, anything that could verify the climb. Despite the pressing demands, the 3 climbers vanished. They stopped returning phone calls, they ignored official requests from the Nepalese government, they basically went into hiding and hoped the whole thing would blow over. Unfortunately for them, the story didn't just blow over. Their expedition company started releasing more details about what actually happened. It turns out that Nagima Norbu Sherpa, who had been guiding Vikas Rana, said that he and the other Sherpa guides had given up on the expedition and descended to base camp on May 25th, the day before the alleged summit. Why? Because the climbers simply couldn't move above Camp 3. They were exhausted and physically unable to continue any higher. So the Sherpas, seeing there was no chance of reaching the top, made the call to abandon the ascent and get everyone down safely. And that's how 3 young dreamers from small Indian villages completely destroyed their lives with a lie that unraveled in about 48 hours. But believe it or not, we're not done yet, because the most shocking case of Everest fraud was still to come. It was August 29th, 2020, and Narinder Singh Yadav was about to receive the Tenzing Norgay National Adventure Award. This is India's highest honor for adventure sports. The award was going to be presented to him by President Ram Nath Kovind himself, in recognition of his incredible 2016 Everest summit. The 28-year-old from Haryana had spent 4 years as one of India's most celebrated mountaineers. He traveled the country as a motivational speaker, inspiring thousands of young people with his story of conquering the world's highest peak. He spoke at schools and colleges, telling kids that anything was possible if they just worked hard enough and never gave up on their dreams, just like him. There was just one tiny problem. At the last minute, his name was suddenly pulled from the award ceremony. No public explanation was given. The government just quietly removed him from the list of recipients and hoped nobody would notice. But behind the scenes, India's mountaineering community was in complete uproar. Word was spreading in whispered conversations that something was very, very wrong with his supposed summit. It turned out Narendra Singh Yadav had never actually summited Mount Everest. The discovery of this fraud was almost as incredible as the fraud itself. It started when experienced Indian mountaineers began analyzing Yadav's 2016 summit photos in preparation for the awards ceremony. What they found was absolutely shocking. The photos showed clear signs of digital manipulation. The lighting was inconsistent, the shadows didn't match, and most damning of all, Yadav appeared to have been digitally inserted into photos that other climbers clearly took. But the investigation revealed something even more devastating than just photoshopped pictures. When authorities started tracing Yadav's actual movements on May 20th, 2016, they discovered he had never even attempted to reach the summit. In fact, Yadav and his climbing partner, Seema Rani Goswami, had been rescued at 26,900 feet instead. They were still nearly 2,000 feet below the summit, and they were in such bad shape that other climbers had to risk their own lives to save them. Yet, somehow, this guy who couldn't even make it to the top without being rescued managed to convince Nepal's Department of Tourism that he had successfully summited. He got an official certificate and everything. But here's the part that's almost too perfect to believe. Remember Satyarup Siddhanta, the software engineer who exposed the Rathods when they stole his photos? Well, guess whose photos Yadav had stolen and manipulated for his own fake summit pictures? That's right, the same guy. But it gets even better. Satyarup wasn't just a random climber whose photos got stolen. He was actually part of the rescue team that saved Narendra Yadav's life in 2016. I was in the rescue team that season and we rescued him from Everest balcony, Satyarup revealed. He was not able to go ahead of the balcony. I was shocked to see the summit certificate in his hands. Think about how absurd the whole situation was. Narendra failed so spectacularly on Everest that he needed to be rescued. The guy who helped save his life took some photos during his own successful summit, and then Narendra stole those exact photos, photoshopped his own face into them, and used them to claim he had summited. Now, to be fair, making it within 2,000 feet of Everest's summit is still an incredible achievement. Most people would call that a win, but the truth is, there's a big difference between getting close and actually standing on top. Lots of climbers have turned back at the last stretch, and there's no shame in that. It's a success, just not the summit success, and it's not fair to put yourself in the same league as those who truly made it to the top. But here's the real issue. Instead of owning up to what happened, Narendra spent the next 4 years building his entire reputation on a summit he never reached. From 2016 to 2020, he traveled across India giving inspirational speeches about his Everest experience. He motivated countless young people to pursue their dreams, using a story that was completely fabricated from start to finish. When the fraud was finally exposed, the Indian government had no choice but to take action. In February 2021, Nepal officially revoked Narendra's summit certificate and banned him from climbing in Nepal for 6 years, starting from 2016. But here's where Narendra Singh Yadav's story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Most people caught in such an elaborate lie would disappear in shame, maybe move to a different country and start over with a new identity, but not Narendra. On May 20th, 2022, exactly 6 years after his fraudulent summit claim and right after his ban expired, Narendra quietly returned to Mount Everest. And this time, he actually climbed it. After months of training and acclimatization, Narendra launched his final summit push. In just 6 days, he made his way from base camp to the genuine summit of Mount Everest. setting a record for the fastest ascent by an Indian climber. His expedition was called Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, Fastest Everest Expedition 2022, and they made it to the top at 5:02 a.m. on May 27th. It feels really good. It's like I have been reborn, Notander told reporters after his descent. Can you imagine the mental strength it took to go back to the mountain that had exposed him as a fraud? Most people would never have the courage to face that kind of public humiliation and come back stronger. But it also raises some really disturbing questions. If Notander was capable of climbing Everest in 2022, why did he feel the need to fake it in 2016? What kind of pressure was he under that made him risk everything for a fraudulent summit when he might have been capable of the real thing if he had just waited and trained more? The answer to that question reveals something really dark about the system that creates these desperate lies in the first place. See, in India, achieving an Everest summit isn't just a personal accomplishment, it's a ticket to an entirely different life. Many Indian states offer cash prizes ranging from 500,000 to 1 million rupees for Everest summiteers. That's somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 US dollars, which, in rural India, is life-changing money. But the financial rewards are just the beginning. Summiteers often receive automatic recruitment into police, defense, or government services. If they're already employed by the government, they can get massive promotions. National awards like the Tenzing Norgay National Adventure Award carry incredible prestige and can transform someone's entire social status overnight. In Indian culture, an Everest summit doesn't just elevate the individual, but their entire family and community. Local newspapers celebrate such achievements extensively. Politicians line up to be photographed with summiteers. There's enormous cultural pressure to succeed once someone publicly declares their attempt. The shame of failure in such circumstances must have seemed absolutely unbearable. When faced with the choice between admitting defeat and constructing a lie, some chose deception. It wasn't greed that motivated them, but pure, desperate fear of disappointing everyone who believed in them. And here's the really messed up part. Before these cases came to light, Nepal's summit verification process was shockingly weak. There was no mandatory GPS logging. Summit certificates were often issued based solely on submitted photos and guide reports from expedition companies. Nepali officials rarely verified claims directly. The system had created the perfect storm: enormous pressure to succeed, life-changing rewards for achievement, and weak verification processes that made fraud seem not just possible, but easy. What makes these stories particularly heartbreaking is that many of these fraudulent climbers weren't part of India's elite mountaineering circles. The Rathods were police officers with some climbing experience. They'd even claimed to complete the Aussie 10 challenge in Australia. But Vikas, Shobha, and Ankush were relative amateurs, not known in any serious mountaineering community. Notander was a government employee. None of them had the extensive high-altitude experience you'd expect from seasoned Everest climbers. They were simply regular people who had been swept up in the cultural obsession with Everest summits, and they simply weren't prepared for the reality of what they were attempting. Lacking proper training, preparation, and sometimes even basic mountaineering experience, they found themselves physically and mentally incapable of completing the summit. The really tragic part is that their lies didn't just harm themselves. Every fraudulent summit undermines the incredible achievements of legitimate climbers. It makes people question the validity of real accomplishments and tarnishes their reputations. But you know what? There are heroes in these stories too. People like Satyarup Siddhanta, who could have easily stayed silent when his photos were stolen. Mountain rescue teams refused to stay quiet about who they actually saved and who they didn't. Expedition companies eventually started choosing integrity over profit, even when it meant admitting their own clients had failed. Since these major fraud cases came to light, both Nepal and India have completely overhauled their verification processes. GPS tracking is now often required for summit claims. Photo analysis has become much more sophisticated, with experts trained to spot digital manipulation. Expedition companies now face much harsher punishments for helping dubious clients with false summit claims. The age of fraud is over. These stories aren't really about mountaineering fraud when you get down to it. They're about what happens when society creates impossible expectations and then offers life-changing rewards for meeting them. They're about ordinary people who weren't prepared for their dreams to become nightmares. But Mount Everest doesn't care about your motivations. It doesn't care about the promises you made to your spouse, the hopes of your village, or the dreams of your family. It judges everyone with the same cold indifference. In the end, the mountain always tells the truth, even if it takes 4 years for that truth to come out. Some lies are written in stone, but on Everest, they're written in ice. And ice, as these climbers learned, always melts under scrutiny. May 24th, 2006. On Everest's summit, a Sherpa stood completely naked for 3 full minutes. At nearly 30,000 feet, in the death zone, climbers struggle for every breath. Imagine fighting to stay alive while the guy next to you strips off his clothes. And 25-year-old Lakpa Tarke Sherpa took off every layer. Jacket, boots, pants, gone. To some, it was bravery. To others, it was blasphemy. Everest isn't just a mountain, it's Chomolungma, the goddess mother of earth. And this young Sherpa had just exposed himself on the holiest summit in the Himalayas. Why did he do it? What happened after? And why does almost no evidence of this stunt exist today? From the naked Sherpa to a wedding no one should have survived, to a stunt that infuriated the entire climbing world, these are 7 of the most bizarre records ever set on Mount Everest. When you reach the summit of Mount Everest, you're standing on a space about the size of a few ping pong tables. At this altitude, every second counts because your body is literally dying from no oxygen. There's really nothing to do up there except the basics. Most climbers snap a quick photo, maybe say a prayer, and start the life or death descent as fast as possible. The summit isn't a place where you linger or celebrate. It's a place where you survive. But on May 24th, 2006, Lakpa Tarke Sherpa decided to do something completely different. The 25-year-old climbing guide from the village of Portse had been thinking for months about how to make his mark in mountaineering history. He'd climbed Everest before as part of the Adventure Consultants expedition team. He must have understood that at this altitude, what he was about to do was extremely dangerous and could potentially kill him, but Lakpa wanted to do something that had never been done before. So, on the summit, with his shocked climbing partners watching, Lakpa started taking off his clothes. First his heavy down jacket, then his insulated pants, his thermal layers, his boots, everything, until he was standing completely naked on the highest point on Earth. For 3 full minutes, Lakpa stood on Everest's summit while his climbing buddies snapped photos for what they hoped would make it into the record books. 3 minutes might not sound like that long, but imagine standing without clothes in your freezer for 3 minutes. Now imagine that freezer's 5.5 miles above sea level, where there's barely enough oxygen to think straight. But here's where this bizarre record attempt turned into a massive controversy. You see, Lakpa wasn't just setting a weird record. Many people considered what he did to be deeply disrespectful to one of the most sacred places on Earth. To the Buddhist Sherpas of Nepal, Mount Everest isn't just a mountain. It's Chomolungma, the goddess mother of Earth. It's a holy site that's been revered for thousands of years, and Lakpa had just stripped completely on their most sacred mountain for personal fame. The head of Nepal's Mountaineering Association was furious. If he did it, it is very shocking because Sagarmatha is the goddess mother. The government must enforce strict ethics for climbing, he said, using the mountain's Nepali name. Lakpa himself also did not publicly state his reason for doing such, though his team later said they would submit the incident to Guinness, suggesting it was meant as a record attempt. And here's the really disturbing part. If you try to search for photos of Lakpa's naked summit online, you'll find almost nothing. There's allegedly only one image available anywhere on the internet. Some people believe that Nepal suppressed the other photos because of the shame and outrage Lakpa's stunt caused. Whether that's true or not, Lakpa's 3 minutes of nudity at nearly 30,000 feet remains one of the most controversial records in mountaineering history. And as shocking as this was, it's nothing compared to the record we'll cover at the end, the one that made Reddit explode with rage. Our next record holders had an even more bizarre idea that could easily have them killed. You see, most people spend months planning their dream wedding. They book the perfect venue, invite family and friends, hire photographers. But in 2005, 24-year-old Moni Mulapati and 23-year-old Pem Dorji Sherpa had a very different idea for their special day. These two young Nepalis had been climbing together for weeks, struggling through the Khumbu icefall, battling altitude sickness, pushing their bodies to the absolute limit. And when they finally reached the summit on May 30th, they had something very specific in mind. With fellow climbers watching in complete shock, Moni and Pem pulled off their masks and fumbled with plastic flower garlands with hands that were numb from cold and shaking from oxygen deprivation. Pem tried to apply the traditional red sindoor powder to Moni's forehead, but his hands were trembling so badly he could barely control his movements. Then, at 29,029 feet above sea level, they performed a traditional Nepali wedding ceremony. This wasn't some long romantic ceremony. The entire thing lasted just 10 minutes because, well, you can't exactly have a long wedding when you're in the death zone. Every second you spend on the summit increases your chance of never making it back down. Your heart is already working overtime just to keep you alive. And now, you're asking it to function without the supplemental oxygen that's keeping you from passing out. But in those 10 minutes, Moni and Pem became the first couple in history to get married on top of the world. None of the other climbers had any idea what they were witnessing. Imagine you've just completed the climb of your life. You're exhausted, barely able to think straight from lack of oxygen, and suddenly the two people next to you start having a wedding ceremony. The other climbers probably thought they were hallucinating from altitude sickness, but there was actually a deeper meaning to their mountaintop marriage that made this risk worth taking. You see, Moni was from the Newar community, and Pem was a Sherpa, an unusual pairing in Nepal's rigid caste system. In Nepali society, marriages typically happen within the same social group, arranged by families who've known each other for generations. For a Newar woman to marry a Sherpa man was already controversial enough to cause family conflicts and social ostracism. Their wedding on Everest was meant to send a powerful message that love could overcome social barriers. With our interracial marriage, we also wanted to give the message that caste and race has no barriers when it comes to marriage, Pem later said. They were literally risking their lives to prove that their love was stronger than centuries of social tradition. When the news finally broke after their descent, the reaction was mixed. Some people celebrated their courage, others were less pleased that they'd used the sacred mountain for what they saw as a publicity stunt. But for young couples facing similar caste barriers across Nepal, Moni and Pem had just proven that love could literally conquer the highest mountain on Earth. Mountaineering officials in Kathmandu said they'd never heard of anyone getting married on Everest's summit before, and honestly, who else is going to attempt that record? It's not exactly easy to find competition, but as bizarre as a mountaintop wedding sounds, at least it was done with love and respect. Our next record holder had a very different kind of ceremony in mind. When 31-year-old Ratnesh Pandey reached the summit of Mount Everest on May 21, 2016, he had a very specific mission. Most climbers celebrate their summit with a victory cry, a prayer, or just pure relief that they'd survived the climb. But Ratnesh had something else planned, a plan that almost killed him on his first attempt. Standing at 29,029 feet in the early morning hours, this mountaineer from Madhya Pradesh, India, stiffened himself up and began to sing. And it was not just any song. He was performing India's national anthem, Jana Gana Mana, becoming the first person in history to sing a complete national anthem on the world's highest peak. Can you imagine how surreal that must have been for other climbers? You're standing on a peak the size of a few ping pong tables. The wind is howling around you, the temperature is well below freezing, and you're surrounded by other exhausted climbers who can barely catch their breath, let alone speak in complete sentences. And in the middle of all of this guy starts belting out the Indian national anthem. I've stood on the summit of a 14er in Colorado and seen a climber in a kilt play Amazing Grace on the bagpipes and thought, that was wild. This is next level. For over a minute, while breathing supplemental oxygen between verses, Ratnesh delivered a full patriotic performance at the top of the world. His voice was probably shaky from the cold and thin air, but he pushed through every single line of Jana Gana Mana, while his fellow climbers watched in amazement at the world's most extreme patriotic performance. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. This was actually Ratnesh's second attempt, and the first one nearly killed him. In 2015, he had climbed to 22,000 feet when the devastating Nepal earthquake hit. The 7.8 magnitude quake triggered massive avalanches that cost the lives of 21 climbers on Everest and left hundreds more stranded. Rodnesh was trapped on the mountain in conditions that were basically a death sentence. He had to be rescued while bodies were still being pulled from the wreckage around him. Most people would take that as a sign from the universe to find a safer hobby. The trauma alone would be enough to keep most climbers away from Everest forever, but not Rodnesh. Instead of being deterred, he became more determined. He spent the next year training harder, fundraising relentlessly, and preparing for another attempt. The man was obsessed with the idea of singing India's national anthem on top of the world. He even took out loans worth over 15 lakh rupees, or about $20,000, to fund his return to Everest. Think about that for a second. This man borrowed more money than most people make in a year. Money he'd have to pay back regardless of whether he survived the climb. Also, he could sing his country's national anthem on the highest point on Earth. Later, when Rodnesh was asked about the experience, he said that singing the anthem gave him a sense of peace and strength he needed for the dangerous descent back down. In his mind, this was a spiritual moment, a way of honoring his country from the closest place to heaven he could reach. Whether you find it inspiring or bizarre, you've got to admire the dedication. I mean, who else plans their entire Everest expedition around delivering a musical performance? But as crazy as planning your Everest summit around a musical performance sounds, our next record holders faced an even more impossible challenge. Being an identical twin means you do everything together. You share the same birthday, often the same interests, sometimes even the same clothes. But in 2013, 21-year-old sisters Tashi and Nungshi Malik from India decided to take twin bonding to a whole new level. On May 19, 2013, these identical twins attempted something that had never been done before, something that would require perfect coordination in the world's most dangerous place, where one mistake by either sister could kill them both. Now see, most climbing teams split up during summit attempts for safety reasons. Faster climbers go ahead to avoid getting cold while waiting. Slower climbers take their time to avoid exhaustion and altitude sickness. The death zone isn't a place where you can afford to wait around for your climbing partner. But these twin sisters had a different plan. They were going to attempt something that sounds simple, but is actually incredibly difficult to achieve. They were going to stay together through the entire climb, maintaining the exact same pace all through the most dangerous part of the mountain, the death zone. Think about what this actually means. At 26,000 feet, your body is literally dying with every step. Your heart is pounding, your lungs are gasping for air that barely exists, and every moment feels like you're underwater. Most people are so focused on just putting one foot in front of the other that they can't think about anything else. Yet these twins had to coordinate everything: their rest stops, their oxygen consumption, when to eat, when to drink, even when to change their gear. If one sister started moving too fast, the other could fall behind and get hypothermia from standing still. If one got altitude sickness and needed to rest, they both had to stop in the death zone, where every minute increases their chances of never making it down alive. And their journey to Everest wasn't easy. These sisters faced massive resistance from their male-dominated culture. Most people told them that mountaineering was a boys' thing and that girls shouldn't be taking such risks. Even their own mother said no for 4 years before finally giving permission. 4 years of the twins begging, training in secret, and trying to prove they were capable. Can you imagine wanting something so badly and having your own family block you for years? When she finally agreed, their mother had to take out loans using all her gold jewelry as collateral to fund their expedition. In Indian culture, a woman's gold jewelry is often her life savings, her security for emergencies, so she literally bet everything she owned on her daughter's dream. She told them this would be their first and last climb. Success or not, this is your final chance, and no more of it again, she said. But the twins had other plans. Before they even left for Everest, the twins hid a letter in the back of their parents' closet. If they didn't come back, they wanted their mom and dad to know how much they appreciated their sacrifices and support. They also wanted the chance to say goodbye. That's how seriously they understood the risks they were taking. And somehow, against all odds, they pulled it off. On May 19, 2013, Tashi and Nungshi Malik became the first twins in history to summit Mount Everest together, maintaining perfect coordination through the world's most dangerous climb. It makes you wonder what it was like for other climbers on the summit that day. You're exhausted, barely able to think straight from oxygen deprivation, and suddenly you see two identical women taking photos together. You'd probably think the altitude was making you see double, but these twins had just proven that when you're identical in determination, you can conquer anything, even the world's tallest mountain. After their historic achievement, the twins went on to complete the 7 summits, the highest peak on every continent. They even skied to both the North and South Poles, becoming one of the youngest people ever to complete the Explorer's Grand Slam. Their first and last climb turned into a world record-breaking adventure career. But coordinated teamwork isn't the only way to set records on Everest. Sometimes all you need is one person with a really unusual idea. In 2017, Irish climber Rory McHugh reached Everest's summit with what might be the most casual world record attempt ever. While other climbers were taking solemn photos and saying prayers, Rory had something completely different in mind. Now, I need you to picture this scene. You've just spent weeks climbing through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. You're standing on a summit the size of a small room, surrounded by exhausted climbers who can barely breathe. The wind is howling around you at speeds that can knock you off your feet, and the temperature is well below freezing. Most people at this moment are fighting just to stay upright, desperately trying to take a few photos before their fingers go numb, and counting the seconds until they can start the life-or-death descent. Your brain is so starved for oxygen that simple tasks like operating a camera become monumentally difficult. And in the middle of all this chaos and danger, Rory decided it was the perfect time to pull out a frisbee. Yes, you heard that right. While standing on top of the world's most dangerous mountain, this man decided to attempt the record for the highest frisbee throw in history. But here's what makes this even more ridiculous. Rory actually carried this frisbee all the way up Everest. Think about that for a second. Every ounce of weight matters when you're climbing at altitude. Climbers cut the handles off their toothbrushes to save weight. They carry the absolute minimum gear necessary to survive, and Rory decided that a frisbee was essential equipment for his summit attempt. He'd been planning this stunt for his entire climb, probably imagining how cool it would look when he threw a perfect frisbee from the top of the world. This was going to be his moment of glory, his claim to fame. So after all that preparation, all that training, all those weeks of climbing with a frisbee in his pack, Rory wound up for his record-breaking throw, and a massive gust of wind grabbed the frisbee the moment it left his hands and sent it flying straight into Tibet. He never even completed the throw properly, and his frisbee became an international litter problem. The wind at Everest summit can reach over 90 miles per hour. It's so strong it can literally blow climbers off the mountain, and Rory thought he could control where a lightweight plastic disc would go in those conditions, like trying to throw a paper airplane in a hurricane. The whole thing was such a disaster that Rory actually wrote a public apology on his blog afterward. "I would like to take this opportunity to apologize to the Chinese government," he wrote. "It was not my intention to litter, and if possible, I'd like my frisbee back. It would have been illegal to have crossed into China after it." So technically, Rory might hold the record for the first incomplete world record, the highest frisbee throw that never actually landed where it was supposed to. You see, for an official record, you need to actually complete what you set out to do. Rory's frisbee got snatched by the wind the moment it left his hands and disappeared into Tibet. He never controlled where it went or measured the distance properly. He still claims the record though, and honestly, who's going to climb Everest just to dispute a failed frisbee throw? The official record books probably don't have a category for most expensive littering incident. I love imagining Chinese border patrol finding a random frisbee somewhere in Tibet and trying to figure out how it got there. Suspicious plastic disc found at 15,000 feet, no footprints or vehicle tracks in the vicinity. Disc appears to have fallen from the sky. Well, it must have come from Everest, is probably not the first explanation they'd put in their report. But as ridiculous as Rory's frisbee fail was, at least he was wearing proper climbing gear. And at least Rory's stunt was harmless. We're almost at our final record on this list that put other climbers' lives in danger, and the internet never forgave him. In 2007, a 48-year-old Dutch extreme athlete named Wim Hof decided he was going to attempt something that defied every rule of high-altitude mountaineering. While other climbers were bundling up in thousands of dollars worth of specialized gear, Wim had a very different approach in mind. He decided he was going to climb Mount Everest wearing nothing but a pair of shorts and shoes. Now, before you think this is just another publicity stunt, you need to understand who Wim Hof is. This isn't some random guy who got a crazy idea after watching too many motivational videos. Wim, known as the Iceman, had already set world records for swimming under ice and spending prolonged periods in full body contact with ice. He'd run a barefoot half marathon on ice and snow in Finland. This man had spent decades training his body to withstand temperatures that would kill most people. But even for someone with Wim's superhuman cold tolerance, attempting Everest in shorts was pushing into completely uncharted territory. I mean, it's Everest. We're talking about a mountain where the temperature regularly drops to below freezing and the wind can literally freeze your tears solid. Wim's plan was based on what he called the Wim Hof method, a combination of breathing techniques, meditation, and gradual cold exposure that he claimed could allow the human body to override its natural survival responses. He genuinely believed that with the right mental preparation, he could climb the world's tallest mountain in the same outfit you'd wear to a summer barbecue. Imagine the reaction when this bearded Dutchman in tan shorts and a red headband showed up at Everest Base Camp. The Sherpas probably thought he was completely insane. Other climbers must have assumed he was some kind of tourist who'd gotten lost on his way to a beach vacation. But here's the funny thing. Wim actually started making progress at first. From base camp, he climbed to Camp 2 at about 22,000 feet, wearing just shorts and sandals. Let me put that in perspective. That's higher than the summit of Denali, North America's tallest mountain. Most people would be fighting for their lives at that altitude, even with full protective gear. At Camp 2, Wim finally conceded to wearing boots so he could attach crampons, the metal spikes climbers need to grip the ice. But he kept going in just his shorts, pushing higher and higher and dangerously closer into the death zone. And that was when the mountain finally got its revenge on the Iceman. At around 24,300 feet, Wim was forced to abort his attempt. The reason? A foot injury that was actually frostbite. It was the ultimate irony. The man who'd built his entire reputation on withstanding extreme cold was defeated by extreme cold. He never made it to the summit, stopping roughly 4,600 feet short of his goal. All those years of ice baths, breathing exercises, and mental conditioning, and in the end, Everest proved that some things are bigger than human willpower. Dr. Kem Kamler, an orthopedic surgeon who's literally pulled frostbitten climbers off Everest and watched people die from hypothermia, couldn't believe what Wim had attempted. This is a guy who's seen every possible way the mountain can destroy the human body, and even he was shocked. No one has come close to climbing Everest in those kinds of conditions, he said. And honestly, after Wim's attempt ended in frostbite, no one probably ever will again. The craziest part is that Wim's partial success actually proved both sides of the argument. Yes, the human body can be trained to withstand incredible cold. After all, he made it further in shorts than most people make in full gear. But it also proved that Mount Everest doesn't care about your breathing techniques or your world records. At some point, physics and biology take over, and the mountain always wins. But even Wim's epic failure in shorts was nothing compared to what happened in 2024, because our final record holder managed to do something that made the entire climbing world want to ban him from mountains forever. In May 2024, American fitness influencer Devin Levesque reached the summit, and he had something very specific planned. According to Devin, he'd just climbed for 72 hours straight with no sleep and was completely exhausted. When he finally made it to the summit, clipped into safety ropes with other climbers nearby, his million-plus Instagram followers were waiting to see what he'd do at the top of the world. What he did next shocked everyone who witnessed it. Let me paint the scene for you. You're standing on a summit about the size of a few ping-pong tables, surrounded by other exhausted climbers who can barely stand up straight. Your brain is so starved for oxygen that simple tasks become monumentally difficult. Most people at this moment are fighting just to stay upright. They're desperately trying to take a few photos before their fingers go numb from the cold, saying a quick prayer, and counting the seconds until they can start the life or death descent. Every moment you spend on the summit increases your chances of never making it back down alive. This isn't a place where you do gymnastics, but Devin had other ideas. He pulled out his phone, started recording, and announced, "Good morning from the top of Mount Everest." Then, at 29,032 feet above sea level, where one wrong move means certain death, Devin performed what he claimed was the first backflip at the highest altitude in the world. The mountaineering community went absolutely ballistic. Reddit threads exploded with people calling him everything from a clown to even harsher words, and considered him a man who didn't respect the mountains. And they had good reason to be angry. First, when Devin landed his backflip, he came down right next to the safety ropes that kept everyone from falling off the mountain. One bad landing, and he could have damaged the fixed lines that every climber depends on to stay alive, or worse, sent himself or someone else tumbling into the abyss. Second, Devin was clearly exhausted and hypoxic from the climb. When your brain isn't getting enough oxygen to function properly, when you haven't slept for 3 days, when your body is literally shutting down, this is not the time to be doing acrobatics. Professional gymnasts don't perform backflips when they're drunk or sick, but Devin thought it was fine to do one when his body was in survival mode. But here's what really enraged people. Devin immediately started bragging about his new world record and promoting his social media brand. He treated the sacred summit like his personal gymnasium, showing complete disrespect for the mountain and the over 300 people who have died trying to climb it. Within hours, he was posting about his achievement across all his social platforms, turning what should have been a moment of reverence into a social media stunt. The backlash was so harsh that outdoor publications, mountaineering forums, and even non-climbers condemned the stunt. Many called for him to be banned from future expeditions. To many climbing fans, this was exactly what's wrong with modern Everest. People treating it like a backdrop for social media content instead of respecting it as one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Whether you think it's impressive or reckless, one thing's certain. Devin Levesque's backflip has become the most hated record in Everest history, sparking debates about social media culture, safety, and respect for the mountains. September 25th, 1996, 11 a.m., 24,000 feet, Mount Everest. The mountain moves. A wall of snow and ice breaks loose somewhere above, accelerating and moving at 200 miles an hour. Then, it hits him like a frozen time bomb. There's no warning, no escape, just a man, the mountain, and the sound of everything ending at once. He dies on that mountain, but the world has already decided he deserved to. Today, I'm taking you inside the story of how the world's most beloved Sherpa became its most hated. Lobsang Jambu Sherpa was born in 1971 to a Sherpa family in the Rolwaling Valley of Nepal. Like every Sherpa child, he grew up with the mountains not as a destination, but as a backyard. The altitude that makes other people dizzy and nauseous was simply the air he breathed from the day he was born. But being born a Sherpa doesn't automatically make you elite. Thousands of Sherpas live in those valleys. Only a handful ever become what Lobsang became. In 1993, at just 22 years old, Lobsang made his first summit of Everest without supplemental oxygen. Think about how crazy that is. His very first Everest attempt, and he didn't even use a bottle. Most climbers would have called that a career highlight and gone home. Lobsang went back that same year. In the fall of 1993, he summited Cho Oyu, the 6th highest mountain on Earth. Then, that same winter, when Everest was considered unclimbable, he joined a Japanese expedition that reached Camp 4 at 26,000 feet. In the spring of 1994, he was back on Everest for summit number 2, again without oxygen. He was 23. His back-to-back summit ascents were so impressive that Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants, the most respected commercial expedition operator on the mountain, took notice. He hired the best, and Lobsang was just that, the best. Lobsang summited Everest the next year with Hall in 1995 for the 3rd time, again without oxygen. In Nepal, these achievements made him a legend. The young man from the Rolwaling Valley who had done what almost no Sherpa his age had ever done. In the tight-knit world of Himalayan climbing, people said his name with admiration. That same summer, Lobsang joined an American climber named Scott Fisher on Broad Peak in the Karakoram Range. And somewhere on that mountain, between the shared exhaustion and the thin air, and the trust that only exists between people who have kept each other alive, Fisher and Lobsang became something more than employer and employee. So for the 1996 season, Scott Fisher, one of the most elite high-altitude mountaineers alive and leader of the Mountain Madness climbing team, gave him the title of Sirdar for his team's expedition. The Sirdar is the most senior position a Sherpa can hold on an expedition. He's responsible for every other Sherpa, every rope fixed, every camp built, every load carried, every life protected. Holding the title meant Scott considered Lobsang the most experienced and trusted climbing Sherpa available. He was 25 years old. Lobsang was an extraordinary climber, but climbing Everest and guiding people up it are two completely different things. Climbing is about you, your body, your decisions, your risk. Guiding is about pushing other people through their fears and limitations. Their lives are in your hands. One wrong call and it's not just you that pays the price. Outside of big expedition climbs, there was no record of Lobsang guiding clients or building the kind of experience this role demanded. Was being the best climber on the mountain enough to make you the best guide on it? Scott Fisher thought so. Lobsang agreed, and in the spring of 1996, they were about to find out. May 1996. If you were standing at the base of Everest that spring, what you would have seen would have taken your breath away. Everywhere you looked, tents, ropes, expedition flags snapping in the wind. Teams from New Zealand, America, Taiwan, India, South Africa, all wanting the same thing. By 1996, Everest had become a product, something you could buy if you had enough money, and the two men selling that dream were the best in the business. The first was Rob Hall, a New Zealander, calm, methodical, precise. He had summited Everest 5 times, had guided 39 clients to the top without losing a single one. If summiting Everest were a surgery, Rob Hall was the surgeon you wanted holding the knife. And then there was Scott Fisher, an American with a big personality, the kind of man who walked into a room and owned it without trying. He had summited Everest and K2 without oxygen. He was known throughout the climbing world as Mr. Rescue, a man who had turned back from his own summit attempts just to save strangers in distress. If you wanted to reach the summit safely, Scott was your guy. In May 1996, Lobsang's team, Scott Fisher's Mountain Madness, had been on the mountain for weeks. And what a team it was. There was Neil Beetleman, an experienced high-altitude guide, and Anatoly Bukriv, a Kazakh climbing machine who had summited Everest without oxygen before. Then the clients, Martin Adams, Charlotte Fox, Tim Madsen, Clev Schoening, Lean Gamelgard, and Dale Cruz. And then there was Sandy Hill Pittman. Sandy was Manhattan royalty. Her husband was Bob Pittman, the man who co-founded MTV. Her social circle included Tom Brokaw, Blaine Trump, and some of the most powerful names in American media. Vanity Fair had profiled her. New York Magazine had called her the Martha Stewart of mountaineering. She had completed 6 of the 7 summits challenge of climbing the highest peak on each of the 7 continents. Everest was her last stop. And for her summit attempt, she had arranged a live dispatch deal with NBC to file updates from the mountain directly to millions of Americans in real time. If Sandy Hill Pittman stood on top of Everest with a Mountain Madness logo on her jacket, every wealthy American with a dream and a checkbook would be knocking on Scott Fisher's door. Getting her to the summit would have been worth more to Fisher than any advertising campaign he could ever run. Sandy knew it, Scott knew it, everyone knew it. The only one who didn't know it, or didn't care, was the mountain. Because 1996 was a season of darkness. For weeks, the weather on Everest was absolutely savage. Storms came out of nowhere and pinned climbers inside for days at a time. Even though the season was already well underway by early May, not a single climber from any expedition had reached the summit. Not one. It was as though the mountain itself simply did not want to be climbed that year. For Lopsang, it had already gotten personal. His own uncle, Engawon Topchi, was climbing with Fisher's team that season. In April, high on the mountain, his body gave out due to severe altitude sickness. He was quickly taken off Everest, fighting for his life. Then, Scott's client, Dale Cruz, collapsed at Camp 2 with altitude sickness, and Scott, because that's the kind of man he was, personally left his own preparation behind to escort Cruz back down to base camp. It was noble and selfless, sure, but also absolutely devastating for his body. As Sirdar, Lopsang watched all of this. He watched Scott personally expend energy no one at that altitude could afford to lose. He watched his team struggle, and the weather refused to cooperate. It must have hurt him deeply to see the season turn out like this. But what could he do? He was doing his job. Every problem that needed solving, Lopsang solved it. Every load that needed carrying, Lopsang carried it. The season looked doomed, but on May 9th, and for the first time in weeks, the weather forecast came in with good news. A summit window was opening. It was short, just a couple of days at most between storms. If they were going to summit that season, it had to be now. After weeks of waiting, they finally had a chance. Scott made the call for his team. So did Rob Hall and all other expedition leaders on that side of the mountain. Tonight, we all climb. The plan was simple. At 11:30 p.m., climbers from multiple expeditions would push off from Camp 4 into the dark. 2 men were supposed to leave 90 minutes ahead of everyone else, Lopsang and Rob Hall's Sirdar, Ang Dorji. Their job was to get ahead of the group and fix the ropes on the mountain's upper slopes. First, above the balcony at 27,600 feet, and then the Hillary Step at 28,000 feet. Those ropes were the difference between climbers moving quickly toward the summit and standing still on Everest's most exposed section. And in a summit like this, where time was everything, they were extra critical, because that summit day of 1996, both Scott Fisher and Rob Hall had set a hard 2 p.m. turnaround time for their team. The reason for this was simple: Everest maths. If you're not heading back down by 2 p.m., you will not make it back to Camp 4 before it gets dark. And descending Everest in darkness is simply a death wish. There was zero margin for error that day. But before any of that could happen, Lopsang had something else to deal with first. The day before the summit push, Lopsang carried 80 pounds of equipment from Camp 3 to Camp 4. Equipment like the team satellite phone, oxygen canisters, and personal gear belonging to other members. The kind of load that keeps an expedition alive up high. This was his job as Sirdar. But carrying 80 pounds at 26,000 feet takes a heavy toll on anyone, even an elite Sherpa like Lopsang. At those heights, your body is only getting about a third of the oxygen it gets at sea level, which means your muscles are working 3 times as hard to do the same thing. So that 80-pound load felt physiologically closer to 240 pounds. That's like strapping 3 average grown men to your back while climbing 2,400 vertical feet. When Lopsang finally got to his Camp 4 that evening, his body was spent. Expedition members saw him vomiting. In a few hours, 33 climbers would be pushing for the summit. Lopsang was supposed to be 90 minutes ahead of all of them, as promised. He wasn't. At 11:30 p.m. on May 9th, the climbers pushed off from Camp 4 into the dark, and Sherpa Lopsang was among them, not ahead, among them. And somewhere in that darkness moving up, Lopsang made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. One of the team members was struggling and falling behind, fighting for every step, and Lopsang did what Sherpas do. He helped them. He attached a short rope between himself and the struggling climber and began pulling them up the mountain. That climber was Sandy Hill Pittman. Short roping is a standard guide technique. You tie yourself to a struggling client and essentially move together, the guide absorbing some of the client's weight and momentum. At sea level, it's not as hard, but at 26,000 feet, it is an incredibly difficult task. Every step he took pulling Sandy Pittman meant he was falling further and further behind where he was supposed to be. And this was all on a body that was already running on empty from carrying 240 pounds worth of load the day before. The whole stress caught up with him. At 27,600 feet, just above the balcony, Neil Beetleman found Lopsang vomiting on the slopes again, with Sandy beside him. He was physically wrecked. He had been towing Sandy for hours and had nothing left in the tank. Neil reached into Lopsang's pack and took out the rope bag. He and the other Sherpas pushed ahead to fix the lines toward the south summit. But the damage was already done. Ang Dorji from Rob Hall's expedition had been waiting for Lopsang at the balcony for over an hour. He would not fix ropes alone, so he waited. And while he waited, 33 climbers piled up behind him on the most exposed section of Everest. That's 1 hour lost in a summit bid when time was everything. Further up the mountain, at the Hillary Step, around 28,000 feet, the ropes weren't fixed there either. Another queue, waiting for guides to do what should have been done hours ago. The 2 p.m. turnaround time came and went, and the first climbers hadn't summited yet, and climbers were still going up. Scott Fisher himself didn't reach the top until 3:45 p.m., nearly 2 hours past the deadline he had set himself. Meanwhile, Lopsang himself was pushing forward. He was spent, but moving. He reached the summit. It was his 4th Everest summit with no oxygen, exhausted, torn up, and responsible for about 8 clients, but he did it. An incredible achievement. But there was no celebration this time, because Lopsang looked down from that summit, and what he saw was every high-altitude climber's worst nightmare. The sky to the south was no longer blue. It was a wall. A dark, churning, moving wall of cloud and wind is eating everything in its path and coming fast. It was an Everest storm, and Lopsang knew that meant death if it caught him at the summit. So he turned and started moving down fast. Below him, the mountain was already falling apart. The storm hit the mountain like a freight train. Winds that reached 67 miles per hour swarmed the mountain. Temperatures dropped below freezing. At the South Col, around 26,000 feet, 12 climbers from multiple expeditions, including Lopsang clients, became completely disoriented in the whiteout. Charlotte Fox, Tim Madsen, and Sandy Pittman had collapsed entirely. The other climbers were wandering in confused circles less than 100 feet from the edge of an 11,800-foot drop into Tibet. Rob Hall was stranded above the Hillary Step at 28,900 feet with a client who could no longer move. Anatoly, his fellow guide, had already descended to Camp 4, leaving the stranded climbers without a guide on the mountain. This was the chaotic, messy world he was descending into. But Lopsang didn't know any of that yet, because on his way down, at around 27,600 feet, he saw something that made him stop in shock. Scott Fisher was sliding down the mountain on his backside, barely conscious, barely in control. The man who had called Lopsang his brother was in serious trouble. Lopsang reached him immediately and put an oxygen mask on his face, and in a brief moment of sanity, Scott looked up and said something that stopped Lopsang cold. "I am very sick, too sick to go down. I am going to jump." What was happening to Scott physiologically was devastating. His lungs were filled with fluid. Altitude sickness was swelling his brain inside his skull. His body was shutting down organ by organ. The delusions, the desire to jump, were his brain misfiring. He had reached his limit as a climber at the worst possible moment. Lopsang grabbed Scott and tied him to a rope on that ledge. If he hadn't, Scott was going to step off the mountain. They were at 27,600 feet in the death zone with no shelter and no help coming. The storm was building around them, and Lopsang sat down next to a man he couldn't carry and would not abandon. Scott kept telling him, "Lopsang, you go down." Lopsang kept refusing. For over an hour, they sat there together on that ledge. The wind was picking up. The cold was deepening. Lopsang's own body was running out of everything it had left. And then Scott asked him one more time, "Go down, send Anatoly up." This time, Lobsang listened, because he had done all he could. He made Scott as comfortable as he could on that ledge. He looked at the man who had called him his brother, and he turned and walked down into the storm alone. He was the last person to ever see Scott Fisher alive. Lobsang made it back to Camp 4 that night alone. Physically, he was destroyed. Emotionally, he was wrecked. He had sat in the death zone for over an hour, next to a man he called brother, watching him fade away. But the night wasn't over. Back at Camp 4, Anatoly Bukriv, his fellow mountain guide, was making solo rescue trips into the storm, pulling people out of the darkness one by one. He safely rescued Charlotte, Tim, and Sandy out of the snow one by one and into safety. It was extraordinary. And Lobsang, despite everything his body had been through, was there helping to coordinate. Together with Anatoly, they did everything two exhausted men at 26,000 feet in a blizzard could possibly do. Pulling people in, making calls, keeping whoever was left alive through the longest night of their lives. 8 people died in that Everest attempt of 1996. It remains one of the deadliest incidents in Everest's history. And when the survivors finally made it back to base camp, broken and frostbitten and barely alive, the world was already trying to figure out who to blame. The story of what happened on May 10th, 1996 was always going to be told. When 8 people die in a single disaster, the world wants answers, someone to point fingers at. And the man who told that story was John Krakauer. John was a journalist who had been on that mountain as a client on Rob Hall's team. He survived. In the months after the disaster, he was writing a long-form first account of what he saw for Outside magazine. His piece eventually turned into a best-selling book, Into Thin Air, that was read by millions of people around the world. In its pages, Lobsang Jangbu Sherpa was described as hauling Sandy Pittman up the mountain like, and these are John's own words, a horse pulling a plow. A man who had lost sight of what he was supposed to be doing up there. He described Lobsang as exhausted, vomiting, and compromised, and connected these directly to the rope-fixing failure that delayed everyone. To John, Lobsang's actions and poor judgment contributed directly to 8 deaths. Sandy Pittman, in John's view, was a symbol of everything that was wrong with climbing. She was the socialite who did not belong, the rich woman whose summit of Everest was so valuable to Scott that even his lead Sherpa risked the entire expedition to save her, and people died because of it. This was the narrative that reached millions of readers. Now, John might not have meant it that way. After all, he had a footnote saying Lobsang was certainly no more culpable than any of us. But footnotes don't make headlines, and when a book sells millions of copies, footnotes don't matter. What matters is what millions of people read, and what millions of people read was that Lobsang Jangbu Sherpa had cost people their lives. In the span of 1 year, Everest's most celebrated Sherpa had become its most hated. I'm not here to assign blame or make claims about anyone. Everyone now accepts that 1996 was a perfect storm of bad decisions, bad luck, and bad weather made by multiple people at every level of those expeditions. And 1996 was a long, long time ago. But this is the danger of a single story. When one man with a publishing deal and a massive platform tells a narrative the world can easily understand to an audience looking for a scapegoat, things can go very wrong very fast for the man on the other side of that narrative. Before that book even reached the public, Lobsang knew what was coming. He had seen a copy of the article before it was published and knew exactly what millions of people were about to read about him. So in August 1996, Lobsang wrote his response to Outside magazine. It was the only public statement he ever made. On the rope-fixing failure, he wrote, "On all expeditions, whoever goes first from Camp 4 is supposed to fix ropes. Rob Hall's group left 45 minutes ahead of us. In my group, there were 2 guides who were paid considerably more money than me. That these strong professional guides sat waiting for Sherpas or me to come up and fix lines seems ridiculous. On his vomiting, which John had characterized as evidence of his decline, he said, "I have been over 26,000 feet many times. Each time I vomit. It is just something I do. It means nothing. I have done it on all successful expeditions, when leading or following." On the controversial short rope decision, he wrote, "Scott Fisher did not order me, nor did Sandy Pittman offer a cash bonus to short rope her. I made the decision to short rope any team member who was having trouble. This was to ensure all group members would have a good chance of making the summit. This was my goal, our team's goal. I worked very hard on this expedition. All members of my group would agree with this. I do not understand how John Krakauer, involved in a different expedition, could write statements that judge my work habits." And then, in the very last line of that letter, he wrote, "My name is misspelled and my age misrepresented." The most famous account of the worst day of his life couldn't even get his name right. May ended, June passed. Funerals for the dead happened. Despite the disaster that happened just months before, by September 1996, Everest was open to climbing again. That's just how the mountain works. Life doesn't stop for the dead. This time, a Japanese expedition was attempting to summit via the standard Southeast Ridge route. They needed Sherpas, so they hired the best ones available, and one of them was Lobsang Jangbu. Why did he go back? Honestly, I have no idea. And he didn't explain himself. Most people who survived what he survived would never step foot on the mountain again. So where did he find the strength to show up months after the worst moment of his career? We will never know. What we know is that Sherpa guides work both the spring and fall seasons. We know he had a wife and a 5-month-old daughter at home. And we know that in 1996, mountain climbing was a profession where you work or you don't eat. You show up or someone else takes your place, and your family goes without. That's the reality of the job. For this particular expedition, Lobsang wasn't running the show. He was simply doing what Sherpa guides do, fixing ropes and carrying loads. On September 25th, 1996, Lobsang was at 24,000 feet on the Lhotse Face. The Lhotse Face is the massive wall of blue ice that connects Camp 3 at 23,600 feet to Camp 4 at 26,000 feet on the standard Everest route. Every climber attempting Everest via the Southeast Ridge has to cross it. Lobsang was fixing ropes between Camp 3 and Camp 4, the same job he had done on this exact section of the mountain more times than anyone could count. And then the mountain moved. An avalanche broke loose somewhere above them. A wall of snow and ice, thousands of tons of it, accelerating down the Lhotse Face at terrifying speed. The climbers on the ropes below saw it, but it wasn't heading toward them. There was nothing to fear. But then it hit the yellow rock band. Now, the yellow rock band is a thick horizontal shelf of ancient limestone embedded into the face of Everest and Lhotse like a natural ledge. It runs across the mountain for hundreds of feet. When that avalanche hit it, the limestone acted like a ramp, so the entire mass of snow and ice didn't continue straight down. It spilled sideways and across the face of the mountain, at full speed and directly into the fixed ropes where Lobsang and the others were. There was no warning, no time to move, no time to unclip, no time to do anything at all. The avalanche took hold of Lobsang and swept him off the face of the mountain. They searched for days. They never found him. The man Nepal had celebrated and who the world blamed was dead. Lobsang made one tired decision on that mountain, and the world never forgave him for it. Most would even argue that he did everything right. But why was a 25-year-old Sherpa carrying that much weight in the first place? It's May 15th, 2025. Sherpa Palshan Tamang stood just below the Hillary Step, one of the deadliest choke points on Mount Everest, staring down at a man who was dying. His oxygen was nearly gone, his legs barely worked, and the climber he was guiding, Subrata Ghosh from Bengal, frozen, delirious, refused to move. They were 300 vertical feet from the summit, and one terrible, simple decision from never coming home. Palshan tried for hours, begged, pulled, dragged, waited, but Subrata wouldn't budge, and staying meant death for both of them. So he turned around and walked away. This wasn't just a failed climb, it cracked something deeper. The Sherpas are leaving, and once you understand why, you'll never see Everest the same again. To understand why Palshan was forced to make such a horrible decision, you first need to understand who Sherpas really are, and I guarantee you, it's not what you think. Sherpas are an indigenous ethnic group from the Himalayan regions of Nepal and northern India. They've basically lived for centuries in some of the highest inhabited places on Earth. Because of this heritage, most people picture Sherpas as these almost mythical figures, spiritual mountain guardians who were somehow naturally built for extreme altitude, who don't feel pain or fear the way the rest of us do. But that's not just wrong, it's dangerous. Sherpas are regular people. They have families, they get scared, they feel pain, and they die just like anyone else. The only difference is they've been doing this for so long that they've become really, really good at hiding how terrified they are. Let me tell you about a man named Ong Dorje Sherpa. In 1996, during one of the deadliest seasons in Everest history, Ong Dorje earned a reputation for courage that still echoes through every base camp tent. When a whiteout cyclone trapped climbers high on the mountain, he didn't hunker down. He clipped in, turned his headlamp into the teeth of the storm, and climbed back toward the south summit to try to reach Rob Hall and Doug Hansen. While most teams were just fighting to stay alive inside their torn tents, Ong Dorje pushed upward until hurricane gusts and spindrift knocked him off his feet and forced him back. Sadly, in the end, 8 climbers died, including his boss and friend Rob Hall. In the aftermath, witnesses found him standing alone in the screaming wind, sobbing inconsolably over the loss of Rob. Those who knew him understood why he was devastated. As one friend explained, Ong Dorje sees his role on this earth as keeping people safe. Even though Rob was the expedition leader, Ong Dorje would see it as his responsibility to ensure the safety of Rob Hall and Doug Hansen and the others. So when they died, he couldn't help but blame himself. The climbing world called the Western guides heroes for trying to save their clients, and they were. But here's the part of the story that nobody talks about. Ong Dorje survived, but the weight of that survival nearly crushed him. He came down with frost-burned cheeks and fingers so swollen he couldn't hold a cup. He spent weeks recovering in Kathmandu. His family didn't know whether he was alive or dead for days, and when he finally recovered enough to climb again, nobody asked if he was okay. They just expected him to be ready to die for the next group of clients. Because that's the deal every Sherpa makes when they take this job. They're not just guides, they're essentially human insurance policies. When something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong, the Sherpa is expected to fix it, no matter what the cost. But here's what really bothers me about this arrangement. It only goes one way. Even the most successful Sherpas face this reality. Take Ong Shering Sherpa. He's basically royalty in the climbing world, founder of Asian Trekking, one of Nepal's largest expedition companies, former president of the Nepal Mountaineering Association, the kind of guide that wealthy climbers specifically request and pay premium prices to have on their team. This is a man who's been decorated by the King of Belgium, who's led expeditions for decades, who helped build the infrastructure that makes modern Everest climbing possible. He's as successful as a Sherpa can get in this industry. And despite this, someone like him, at the very top of the profession, is still expected to risk everything for his clients without question. Still watch young Sherpas from his community die, saving people who shouldn't be on the mountain. Still part of a system where Sherpa lives are worth less than Western dreams. Even Ong Shering, with all his success and recognition, can't change the fundamental equation. When a wealthy climber gets in trouble, the Sherpa risks everything to save them. But when a Sherpa is the one hanging off a cliff, when they're the ones suffocating in the death zone, Who do you think comes to their rescue? No one. When a Western climber dies, we get detailed news articles about their life, their dreams, and their family back home. When a Sherpa dies, they're lucky if their name gets mentioned at all. Usually, they're just referred to as a local guide or support staff. That tells you everything you need to know about whose life the climbing industry thinks is more valuable. And this isn't some recent development. This has been going on for decades. Tenzing Norgay, the Sherpa who first summited Everest with Edmund Hillary in 1953, was essentially written out of history for years. Most people don't even know his name, even though he was arguably the more experienced climber of the two. The myth of the superhuman Sherpa has created this expectation that these men, and they are almost always men, should be willing to die for people who wouldn't do the same for them. And somehow we've convinced ourselves that this is normal, even noble. But what happens when the people we expect to sacrifice everything finally say no? What happens when they decide their lives are worth more than someone else's adventure? That's exactly what's starting to happen on Everest. And what happened to Palchen and Subrata was just the beginning. But before I get to that, I need to tell you exactly what happened on that climb, because the details of this story will change the way you think about adventure tourism forever. To understand what really happened up there, you need to know exactly how this nightmare unfolded, hour by hour, decision by decision. Palchen Tamang was a Sherpa veteran of several Everest climbs, a compact, quiet man who moved with the easy efficiency of someone who's spent half his life in thin air. He guided everyone from wealthy CEOs to first-timers, and he'd learned to spot trouble before it started. But nothing in his experience prepared him for Subrata Ghosh. From their first meeting, Palchen knew something was off. Not wrong exactly, just off. Subrata had that look, you know the one I'm talking about, that wild-eyed excitement that experienced guides learn to fear. The look that says, I'm here to conquer this mountain, instead of, I'm here to climb this mountain. There's a difference, and on Everest, that difference kills people. Expedition manager Bodraj Bandari would later tell reporters that Subrata was overexcited and ignored repeated warnings. But the thing about being a Sherpa guide is, you can't just turn down a client because they seem too eager and say, sorry sir, but your eyes are a little too bright for my comfort. You take the job, you take the risk, and you hope your experience can make up for their enthusiasm. But on the night of May 14th, when Subrata insisted on starting at 10 p.m. instead of midnight, Palchen felt his first real spike of fear. Not the normal Everest fear that you can learn to live with. This was different. This was his instinct screaming at him that something bad was coming. Most climbers start their summit push between midnight and 2 a.m. because you need to reach the summit by late morning and get back down before the afternoon weather turns deadly. Starting too early puts them near the front of the summit queue. It meant they'd be alone on the upper mountain. No other teams to help if something went wrong. No fresh reports on conditions above. They'd basically be climbing blind. But Subrata didn't care. He wouldn't listen to warnings. He'd trained for years for this moment. He'd paid tens of thousands of dollars. He wanted to go. So at 10 p.m., they started climbing. I want you to imagine what it's like to guide someone through the death zone. To me, it sounds like you're responsible for a toddler, except this toddler weighs 180 pounds and thinks they're invincible. Every few minutes, you have to turn around and check. Are they still moving? Are they clipped to the rope correctly? Are they showing signs of altitude sickness? All while your own body is shutting down and your own brain is starving for oxygen. For the first few hours, things went okay, not excellent, as Subrata was moving slowly even by Everest standards, but okay enough. They passed the balcony at 27,500 feet, probably around 4 a.m., given their slow pace. Still on schedule, barely. By sunrise, they were just 1,000 feet from the summit. At sea level, that's nothing. A 15-minute walk. But at 28,000 feet, in hurricane winds, already exhausted, that's 3 more hours, maybe 4. But then, the wind started. If you've never experienced wind at 28,000 feet, you can't imagine it. This isn't like a storm at sea level. This is wind that hits you like a physical wall. Wind that can literally pick you up and throw you off the mountain. This was the kind of wind that makes experienced climbers turn around. At At that altitude, you're not walking on some wide path. That route to the summit is a knife-edge ridge, sometimes only a foot wide, with a 10,000-foot drop on one side into Tibet and an 8,000-foot drop on the other into Nepal. You're balancing on a tightrope of ice and rock, where even without wind, one wrong foot placement means death. Now, add 60-mile-per-hour gusts to that equation. Every blast of wind tries to rip you off that narrow ridge. You have to lean into it, time your steps between gusts, cling to the fixed rope like your life depends on it, because it does. Palshan had climbed through wind before, but Subrata never had. This was his first time climbing Everest. Palshan tried to check on Subrata, and this must have been when he first noticed, to his dismay, things weren't all right. Subrata kept falling further behind schedule every switchback. Did he signal to him? Did he let him know in the universal mountaineering gesture that we need to go down? I don't know. Either way, Subrata either didn't see it or didn't want to see it. He just kept climbing, one foot, then the other, painfully slow, but determined to reach the summit. Now, you might be asking, why on earth didn't Palshan just call it off? Clearly, he must have known Subrata was not acting rationally. But here's something people don't understand about guiding on Everest. You can't physically force someone to turn around. You can't grab a grown man and drag him down the mountain when he's determined to go up. All you can do is advise and hope they listen. Subrata didn't listen. Finally, at 2 p.m., roughly 13 hours after they'd started climbing, they finally reached the summit. Subrata raised his arms in triumph, took out his camera, posed for the photos that would prove to everyone back home that he'd done it. Palshan probably stood off to the side while he did his guide business of checking his oxygen gauge for the 100th time, watching the clouds building in the south, feeling the wind getting stronger, calculating how much time they had left. The math was simple and terrifying. They'd been climbing for 13 hours. They had maybe 4 hours of oxygen left. The descent would take at least 6 hours in good conditions. In these winds, maybe 8. Palshan probably knew they were in serious trouble, but here's the thing about being a Sherpa guide. You don't get to panic. You don't get to show fear, because the moment your client sees terror in your eyes, they stop functioning entirely. So Palshan buried his fear, pointed down the mountain, and started the descent. The first hour went better than he expected. Subrata was exhausted, stumbling every few steps, but he was moving. They made it past the south summit, past the Cornice Traverse. Every step is a small miracle, every minute stretching their luck thinner. Then they reached the Hillary Step. And before I explain what happened next, picture it. You're at 28,700 feet. The air is so thin that your body is literally dying cell by cell. Below you is a 10,000-foot drop into nothingness. Above you is a 40-foot wall of rock and ice that you need to downclimb, backwards, while exhausted in hurricane winds. And that's when Subrata Ghosh sat down in the snow and spoke 4 words that changed everything. I can't see anything. Now, sudden blindness at altitude isn't uncommon. When your brain doesn't get enough oxygen, your vision is one of the first things to go. Palshan had seen it before. He knew what to do. Get the client down fast before the altitude sickness got worse. But then Subrata said something that made Palshan's blood run cold. I won't move. Let that sink in. At 28,700 feet, in the middle of the death zone, with rescue impossible and oxygen running out, Subrata didn't collapse, he didn't pass out, he made a conscious decision to stop trying. I've read blogs written by adventurers and survival experts who study extreme survival situations. And this is actually more common than you'd think. It's called give-up-itis. When the human brain is pushed beyond its limits, sometimes it just quits. Not dramatically, not with a scream or a fight. It just decides that sitting down and dying is easier than taking one more step. But understanding it doesn't make it any less terrifying when you're watching it happen. And what followed was 8 hours that would haunt Palshan for the rest of his life. First, he tried talking in broken English, in Nepali, in the universal language of desperation. He probably brought up everything he could think of. Subrata's family waiting at home, the celebration that would greet him when he returned, how close they were to safety. But how do you reason with someone whose brain has stopped working properly? When words failed, Palshan did something that goes beyond any job description, beyond any amount of money he was being paid. He decided to physically drag his client to safety. I want you to really think about this. Walking at sea level, even a few feet, is exhausting, let alone dragging another adult. At 28,700 feet, where every step feels like running a marathon, where your body is shutting down minute by minute for the lack of oxygen, Palshan tried to carry another human being for 4 excruciating hours. His muscles must have been screaming for oxygen that wasn't there. His back bent under the weight. His own vision started to blur from the effort. And after all that pain, all that heroic effort, they just moved 300 feet. That's when Palshan collapsed next to Subrata in the snow. Both men were gasping in the thin air. It was clear at this point that they were both dying, just at different speeds. And lying there, Palshan faced a decision that no amount of training prepares you for. His oxygen gauge was hovering near empty. He'd been in the death zone for almost 20 hours. Frostbite was already claiming his fingers and toes. His own body was beginning to shut down. The math was brutal and simple. Stay and both die, leave, and maybe, just maybe, one of them makes it. Palshan stayed longer than he should have. His own survival became a coin flip. When Palshan finally stood up to leave, I imagined Subrata was still conscious, still sitting there in the snow, still refusing to move. Did they make eye contact? Did Palshan say goodbye? Did he promise to send help, knowing that at 28,700 feet, help was impossible? We'll never know. What we know is that Palshan chose life, while Subrata chose the other. As Palshan climbed down, the descent nearly killed him. Without oxygen, his brain began to malfunction. He started hallucinating, seeing people who weren't there, hearing voices in the wind. At one point, he couldn't remember where he was or why he was walking alone in the snow. His body moved on autopilot, following routes burned into muscle memory from years of climbing. Left at this rock, right at that ice formation, clip in here, rest there. All while his conscious mind floated somewhere between life and death. Somehow, and even Palshan doesn't fully remember how, he stumbled into Camp 4 at sunrise. Other climbers found him with severe frostbite, speaking incoherently, more dead than alive. It took him days to recover enough to explain what had happened up there in the darkness near the Hillary Step. Sadly, when Sherpa search teams finally braved the mountains to look for his client, they found Subrata exactly where Palshan had left him, still sitting in the same position, frozen solid in the spot where he'd decided not to move. Now, when news of this got out, the internet exploded. Some people called Palshan a hero for trying as long as he did. Others called him a coward for giving up. Keyboard warriors who had never climbed higher than their stairs were debating whether he had made the right choice. But here's what really bothers me about this whole situation. Palshan shouldn't have been put in that position in the first place. Here's something the adventure tourism industry absolutely does not want you to know. Sherpas are quitting, not just switching companies or taking a season off. They're leaving Everest entirely and telling their sons to do literally anything else for a living. And when I started digging into why this is happening, I found something chilling. Let me tell you something. Most Sherpas are whispering, if not outright saying to the world, Everest is not the same mountain their fathers climbed. And the numbers back them up. In 1996, which was considered a busy year at the time, fewer than 100 people managed to reach Everest's summit. By 2023, that number was over 650. Picture that for a second. 650 people are trying to climb the world's most dangerous mountain in a single season. It's like turning a Formula One racetrack into rush hour traffic, except this racetrack is made of ice that shifts with every storm, ice cracks that open overnight, and avalanche zones that change by the hour. The Hillary Step, where Palshan and Subrata got stuck, now regularly has lines of climbers waiting their turn. Actual lines. On Mount Everest, at 28,800 feet, every minute you wait is a minute closer to death. And who do you think is managing this chaos? Who's setting up the safety ropes, carrying the extra oxygen tanks, and making sure all of these inexperienced climbers don't kill themselves? The Sherpas. But here's the part that made me want to throw my laptop across the room. Most of these people have no business being on Everest. Peer-reviewed data and veteran guides today estimate that as many as 2/3 of people attempting Everest have never been above 20,000 feet before. Think about that. Imagine trying to climb the world's tallest mountain, having never even experienced the kind of altitude that starts shutting down your organs. It's like showing up to perform brain surgery because you watched a YouTube video about it. And when these unprepared climbers get in trouble, which happens constantly, who do you think risks their life to save them? The Sherpas don't just carry gear anymore. They've become babysitters, bodyguards, emergency medical technicians, and suicide prevention counselors, all rolled into one. They're expected to not just guide people up the mountain, but to keep them alive when their terrible decisions catch up with them. And they're getting paid almost nothing to do it. A Sherpa guide might make $3,000 to $5,000 for a season that could easily kill them. Meanwhile, clients are paying $50,000 to $100,000 for the privilege of being guided. You do the math. The people taking the biggest risks are getting paid the least. But the money isn't even the worst part. The worst part is what this is doing to Sherpa families and communities. Traditional Sherpa culture has always had a deep spiritual connection to the mountains. Everest, or Chomolungma as they call it, isn't just a tourist destination. It's sacred. It's literally a goddess in their religion. But when your sacred mountain becomes a conveyor belt for thrill seekers, when your sons and fathers are dying to help strangers take selfies at 29,000 feet, how long before that spiritual connection breaks completely? Many Sherpa families are now actively discouraging their children from becoming guides. They're pushing them toward education, towards jobs in the cities, toward anything that doesn't involve risking their lives so people can check something off their bucket list. And honestly, I don't blame them at all. Because what happened to Palshen wasn't just a tragic accident, it was the inevitable result of a system that's completely broken. So here's the question we have to ask ourselves. Is Mount Everest still about adventure, or has it just become death with really good marketing? Real adventure has always involved risk, but it also involved preparation, respect, and understanding that some things are bigger than your personal goals. When you climb a mountain like Everest, you're not just risking your own life, you're risking the lives of everyone who might have to come save you. But somewhere along the way, Everest has turned into a commodity you can buy. And people are convinced that as long as they have enough money, someone else will handle all the dangerous parts for them. Subrata Ghosh wasn't a bad person. From everything I've read about him, he was passionate about climbing, excited to achieve his dream. But his excitement led him to make a series of decisions that put both him and his guide in mortal danger. And that's become the pattern on Everest. Clients treat Sherpas like a safety net, assuming that someone else will always be there to handle the consequences of their poor choices. But safety nets can break, and when they do, real people die. The tragedy isn't just that Subrata died, the tragedy is that his death was completely preventable. If he had listened to his guide's advice, if he had respected the mountain instead of trying to conquer it, both men probably would have made it home safely. But that would have required something our adventure tourism culture doesn't seem to value anymore: humility. For me, the courage Palshen showed trying to save Subrata for 8 hours in the death zone is incredible. But what's even more incredible is that he was put in that position in the first place. And the real tragedy here isn't what happened in those final moments at the Hillary Step. The real tragedy is that we've built an entire industry around the expectation that some people should be willing to die for other people's adventures. And the people who've been carrying that burden for decades are finally saying no. Maybe it's time we listen to them. What do you think Palshen should have done? Should he have stayed with Subrata, even if it meant both of them dying? Or did he make the only choice that made sense in that situation? Let me know in the comments.
May 21st, 2016. 4 exhausted climbers stood just 3,000 feet from Everest summit when their Sherpa looked them dead in the eye and said, "Please, back." They didn't, and what happened next would leave bodies scattered across the death zone. loyalty tested to its breaking point, and one climber strapped to his rope in silence forever. Today, we're diving into the chilling moments when Sherpas warned and were ignored. From a man who refused oxygen at 28,000 feet to another who forced his Sherpa past the safe turnaround time, knowing it could kill them both. These are the horrifying stories of Everest climbers who refuse to listen to their guides. And wait until you hear how the last climber's boldest move left even his Sherpa stunned. Around 8 a.m. on May 21st, 2016, Sherpas Paul, a member of a particular West Bengal team, had just summited Mount Everest. His joy knew no bounds as he began to take pictures to mark his successful feat. However, he had no idea what lay ahead for him, or what had become of his fellow teammates, Paresh Nath, Gautam Ghosh, and Sunita Hazra. But before that, let's rewind to how their story began. It was the group's third attempt to climb Everest. In 2014, they had collectively prepared to summit the mountain and gloriously return to their country. Unfortunately, they didn't even get to climb, as the Khumbu icefall had killed 16 Sherpas and forced a shutdown of the entire session. Sherpas dying should always be a huge warning sign, but the 4 climbers didn't give up. The following year, 2015, they gathered their resources and made for the mountain. This time around, a catastrophic earthquake shook Nepal. With broken hearts and empty pockets, they returned home with the fame and pride of successful Everesters. But instead of returning to their less adventurous lives, these people's next set of decisions would shock you. You see, they didn't have all the money in the world, or even a quarter of it. Sherpas Paul was not just indebted to his government, he was in debt, literally. Sherpas was poor, and all he had was a truck that he drove to make ends meet. But that didn't stop him from completing basic and advanced mountaineering courses and participating in different expeditions. Because to Sherpas, that was enough experience to attempt the highest mountain in the world. You need to understand how determined and motivated Sherpas was for him to sell the single truck he owned and other properties so he could make his third and final attempt. You might be wondering why he had such an unshakable motivation. Well, in India, successful Everest climbers not only earn respect, they also get financial incentives from the government. As for Sherpas, he wanted all of it. Another willful member was Paresh Nath, a one-handed tailor on a mission to prove something. For Paresh, giving up after failures meant giving up forever. He was already approaching 60 years, so age was no longer on his side. But Paresh had been dreaming of the day he would make it to the highest point of the world, and he wasn't going to live the rest of his life imagining it. So he got help from different organizations, drew resources, and prepared to climb once again. Gautam Ghosh was a soft-spoken police officer, but his friends say you just had to speak about mountaineering to see his eyes sparkle. He had gone on over 30 expeditions and made 14 successful summits. Gautam was not rich, but the support of his family and colleagues kept him going. Unlike others, he had climbed Everest up to 23,622 feet in 2011. He had to turn back when he got injured, but that meant he needed to try one more time. And when he saw another climber in worse condition, he didn't hesitate to save him. That tells us all how kind and selfless he was. As for Sunita Hazra, she was one of the few Bengali women who were attempting mountaineering. Just that tells you of her brave and determined mind. Sunita's love for mountaineering was from birth, and she went on a lot of treks and expeditions as a young woman. Suddenly, she stopped climbing, and by the time she came back, she was already working a government job as a nurse, wife, and mother. Yet, that didn't stop her from going back with her team for the 3rd time in a row. If willpower were all it took to summit Everest, then this team would have gone and returned safely. But soon, that willpower would land them in the kind of tragedy that leaves you with unanswered questions. Aside from experience and physical health, having a good guide or Sherpa is the key to your summit. Sherpas and the other team members had scraped together enough money to book a low-cost agency called Trekking Camp Nepal. Perhaps, if they had waited longer and saved a few more thousand, they would have gotten a better agency. But they didn't, and Trekking Camp Nepal would go on to provide them with inexperienced Sherpas. There were supposed to be 5 Sherpas for the 4 of them. That made sense. 1 per person and 1 leading the team. Excitement was in the cold air, and everyone was ready to summit this time. They had made their way from the base camp to Camp 1, waiting for their support to join them. The first hour passed, and then the second. Something had gone wrong. Their Sherpas were short of one, and that was supposed to accompany Paresh. At this point, it was already late, and it began to dawn on the group that they might not get to climb the mountain once again. But Sherpas did not let that thought settle in his mind. He had staked his entire life on this climb, and there was no going back home the same way. Sherpas began to climb his way up. I think his decision to move without waiting for his team shows the amount of mental pressure he had put himself under. When his teammates saw that Sherpas had left them behind, they feared that they would miss out too. If there was a slim chance, then why not take the risk? At first, everything was fine. They had made their way to Camp 4 without any issues, and they even got there around 7:30 p.m., which was standard time. But their oxygen reserves were running low, and this was the final summit push. At this point, the altitude gets extreme and only a few tanks aren't enough. To the Sherpas, turning back was the wise decision. Please back, the Sherpa said. But for the team, that was impossible. Most of them had never made it as far as 26,000 feet. Their dream was only 3,000 feet away. A few hours, and they would prove whoever doubted them wrong. But if you're a lifetime fan of the channel, you know that a few hours in the death zone, actually, a few minutes, can be the difference between life and death. But if you don't know what the death zone is, it's the altitude above 8,000 meters, or 26,247 feet, where the air pressure is so low and the oxygen level is about 1/3 of that at sea level. That means the human body doesn't function properly, and the risk of death is significantly increased. I think this courageous group of people experienced identity and legacy pressures. That is, they had framed their self-worth around the ability to reach the summit successfully. When the mind is caged in that way, turning back would equal failure to them. But the hard part to comprehend is the actions of the Sherpas that would further jeopardize the entire mission. As the group struggled to beat the clock with oxygen levels dropping, they noticed that Paresh and the Sherpa assigned to him had separated from them. Remember that Sherpas and his guide were way ahead of the team, so when the others no longer saw Paresh, they believed he was also on the way up. The next time anyone would see him, he had frozen to death, and they would later find out that Paresh's guide had abandoned the older man and descended. That was not the only abandonment that was going to happen that evening. One after the other guides who were with Gautam and Sunita began to go their own separate ways. Gautam and Sunita were soon alone, frostbitten, and out of oxygen. They had always been the closest of the group, and their unity kept them going until the tragic fall. Sunita fell and began to tumble down the mountain. Usually when that happens, the person lands in crevices, and if they don't get help, the hole becomes their gravesite. I wonder if she was still thinking about her dream in those moments, or her little family back home. But Sunita wasn't going to die that day. An ex-soldier and fellow mountaineer called Leslie Binns was also on his way up the mountain. He had seen her and was waiting to catch her. He saw Gautam too, but Sunita was more critical. Her wrist had broken and her fingers were frostbitten. He took her back to his tent, gave her oxygen, and began to warm up her hands. Once Leslie was sure that she would recover, he turned to leave the cave and help his fellow forceman, Gautam. But just like the team, Leslie had also exhausted his strength, and he had no idea when he fell asleep. It is ironic how Gautam, who once saved a man in 2011 on that same mountain while nursing his injury, was left to die there alone. But it was because he had prioritized Sunita's life, and if that is not heroic, I don't know what is. Sherpas, unaware of his teammates' fate, had successfully summited Everest. He stood there, taking in the feeling that comes with accomplishment. But as he spent more time up there, his Sherpa began to panic. Maybe Sherpas thought standing longer could help recover his strength, but that was a dangerous move that would only cause rapid exhaustion. Once more, his Sherpa begged him to descend, but Sherpas had waited too long to summit. He had to take it all in. When his Sherpa saw that he wasn't ready to listen, he turned around and began to descend alone. By the time Sherpas decided to descend, it was too late. He was almost out of oxygen and had no spare tank with him. Determined to make it back home, Sherpas summoned courage, perhaps hoping to meet someone with an extra oxygen tank. He had only descended back to 27,600 feet when he completely ran out of oxygen. Alone and exhausted, Sherpas collapsed and succumbed to his death. When he was found on the morning of May 22, 2016, his body still tethered to his rope at 26,000 feet. If they had listened and turned back on time, maybe Sunita wouldn't have been the only one to return alive. But would they have been able to live with themselves? I guess we would never know. But this story is not as intense as our next story. Let's go from bad to worse. When Joshua Cheruiyot Kurui bade his colleagues at Kenya Commercial Bank farewell and began his journey to Mount Everest Base Camp, he was prepared for everything. Well, everything except for what his persistent resilience would cost him. But if you want to understand why Joshua went to Everest, you have to go back to when he was a teenager. If Joshua had never gone with his schoolmates on a trip to Mount Kenya, maybe he never would have become a mountaineer. But from the moment he stared at the second highest peak in Africa, he promised himself that he'd see the world from its summit. And Joshua kept his promise. Not once or twice, but 20 times. Did that shock you? Well, that's not all. Joshua attempted to climb this 17,057 feet high mountain 3 times in a single day, and that attempt was remarkably successful. I think that tells you a lot about his mindset. After conquering all the peaks in Kenya multiple times, Joshua expanded out of his home country and started tackling other mountains, like Mount Stanley, and even took the harder routes. But what made him popular was his ascent of Mount Kilimanjaro. The mountain stands at 19,341 feet and is the highest peak in Africa. For Joshua, climbing a mountain was not enough. He always needed more, something that would make his attempt different from the rest. For Mount Kenya, he did 3 ascents in one day. But what he did for Kilimanjaro was even more intriguing. Joshua ascended and descended within 15 hours. To put it in context, the least amount of days typically required to summit and descend Kilimanjaro is 5 days. Of course, including the acclimatization days. But Joshua needed none of that. That Kilimanjaro climb made him popular, and people wondered, what is Joshua Kurui going to do next? No matter what they thought, I doubt if they saw Joshua's next mission coming. In 2023, Joshua decided he was accomplished with African peaks and that a certain mountain in Nepal was next. This time, it was far more dangerous. Mount Manaslu is 26,781 feet high, more than 6,000 feet higher than what Joshua was used to. But he didn't only summit Manaslu. Joshua did it without supplemental oxygen. He became the first African to conquer a mountain that is over 26,246 feet high. Although his health took a hit and he had to be in the hospital for a while, Joshua must have started planning his next conquest in the hospital room. He was going to summit the highest peak in the world and the ultimate destination of passionate mountaineers, Mount Everest. And he was going to do it without supplemental oxygen. Even though he liked to take risks, Joshua was a professional mountaineer who took the right precautions. He didn't try to summit without a Sherpa, and since he had never been on Everest before, he asked the agency he hired, 7 Summits Treks, to make sure his Sherpa was very experienced. However, he was too prepared to return home without a photo of himself on Everest. For someone who had conquered mountains on first attempts, I think he had raised the bar so high that returning home without even trying would feel like a failure. So they left base camp together with only one contingency plan in case Joshua's no oxygen mission went wrong. The plan was an emergency oxygen bottle that Nawang would carry with him. With that in place, they had everything under control. Or so they thought. On May 22nd, Joshua and Nawang left Camp 4, where they had been for several days, and began their final push toward the summit. The weather window was tight. Wind speeds had dropped just enough to allow climbers to move, but time was limited. By the time they neared the Hillary Step, just below the summit, everything changed. You see, back in 2023, when Joshua climbed Manaslu, he had survived not 1 but 2 rounds of high-altitude pulmonary edema, which is an altitude sickness that causes fluid to collect in the lungs, causing shortness of breath. Although Joshua made it out of the hospital, his body had become susceptible to altitude sickness, especially since he only waited 1 year before beginning another climb. So, at just 157.48 feet from his dream, Joshua's body began betraying him. They were in the death zone, and this was where the brain needed all the oxygen it could get. It was time to activate Plan B, and Nawang swung into action. He reminded Joshua about their agreement and offered him the oxygen bottle. Since they were only a couple of feet away, Nawang must have felt relieved because the oxygen would sustain them on their way back down. However, he had no idea the kind of man he was guiding. Joshua turned down the oxygen. While survival was on Nawang's mind, Joshua was thinking of victory. Only a few more steps, he must have thought. Just a few steps, and that dream would be all his. Nawang panicked. He pleaded and pleaded with Joshua, watching him as his health deteriorated faster. At this point, his own life was in danger. He reached out to base camp to tell them that Joshua was unwell and that he was behaving irrationally and pushing him away. Dorchi Sherpa, the base camp manager, told Nawang to put him on oxygen and begin descent. Joshua's response was, "No oxygen, pure summit only." Nawang faced an impossible dilemma. As a Sherpa, abandoning a client without permission from base camp could mean termination or even blacklisting. The job was his livelihood. He couldn't afford to lose it. Nawang also knew that leaving Joshua behind meant certain death for Joshua. His bosses told him to wait and keep trying. And perhaps Nawang was delirious himself. He sat down beside Joshua and watched him with his eyes wide open. I think that moment Nawang surrendered to his fate and sat down is absolutely touching. He didn't continue to climb or try to beg Joshua anymore. He just sat there with his eyes wide open as a final act of loyalty and commitment to his client. Joshua remained on the ropes. However, his tossing and turning made him flip upside down. He stayed in that position for a long time, groaning in pain, and passerby climbers could not do anything to help because helping meant spending more time in that zone and risking their own lives. However, only one climber, Mills, stopped and turned Joshua back. At that time, he was still fighting for his life and even managed to zip his suit, which probably came undone from his tossing violently. Truly, Joshua was tough, inside and out. Unfortunately, that was the last time anyone saw him alive. By the next morning, Joshua had passed away from high-altitude cerebral edema, another type of altitude sickness that affects the brain and makes an affected person delirious. As for Nawang, the ever-loyal Sherpa, he froze over in that sitting position and the strong wind had blown his remains away. I try to imagine how dangling upside down, especially in those weather conditions, must have felt for Joshua and what he would have been thinking in those moments. Did he regret not taking that oxygen when he still could? Did he feel guilty as he watched Nawang's glassy eyes stare at him? Or was he content that his life was about to end on the mountain of his dreams? But just when you think you've heard the worst, the next story makes you pause, sit up and ask, how is this even real? On May 20th, 2017, Ravi Kumar began his ascent on Mount Everest with complete trust in his mountaineering skills. He was prepared for everything, or so he thought, because what would happen to Ravi in the following days was definitely not part of his plans. You see, Ravi Kumar was born and raised in Moradabad, Uttar Pradesh, India, into a modest middle-class household. He worked as a college lecturer in Hindi literature to support himself and his dreams. What set Ravi apart was not his background, but the sheer scale of his ambition. He had always been fascinated by the Himalayas and dreamed of standing on top of the world. For someone from a small town with limited means, it was an audacious goal. It wasn't just about the town, you see. Ravi belonged to one of the most oppressed castes in India. Growing up, he hated how much inequality his people had to go through, so he began to climb mountains as a silent protest against the government. His determination was unrivaled, and by the time he was 27 years old, Ravi had summited all the important peaks in the world, except the one and highest, Everest. But to climb Everest, he needed a lot of money. How was he going to afford that with his lecturer's salary? Well, the answer lies in the spirit of communal love. As a passionate speaker and teacher, he was able to convince people of the importance of his journey, and with the help of local sponsors, Ravi began to gather his funds at the grassroots and even at the institutional level. It was difficult to get money from the leaders of his own caste, but his community members supported him, and everyone held their breath as he left for Mount Everest. I believe that when climbers venture to Everest with financial aid, there is an increased pressure to come back victorious. Somehow, they stop thinking about themselves and start to focus harder on their mission. That was exactly what happened to Ravi. Just like hundreds of others, Ravi began his final push from Camp 4 on May 20th, Around midnight, the summit window was narrow, and weather conditions at the time were relatively calm. He ascended alongside his Sherpa guide, Lakpa Wongya, who had summited Everest multiple times. By the time Ravi got to the summit, it was already 1:28 p.m. That time was too dangerous because normally descent starts by noon. But for a man with Ravi's motivation, turning back was impossible. What would he say to those who had contributed to sending him his way? So, when his Sherpa began to insist on their return, Ravi didn't refuse. He forced the Sherpa to continue the ascent with him. He was so sure that he would succeed. Yet, he was indeed right about succeeding in reaching the summit. He placed his country flag on the snowy ground and took pictures there too. He had made his people proud. It was now time to turn back and return to his family. And that's when tragedy struck. Somehow, Ravi fell. Now, when you fall on your descent and there's no one below, only crevices or snow holes can break your fall. The farther away a crevasse is, the greater the effect of the fall on you, especially in extreme weather conditions like on Everest. Ravi rolled almost 656 feet down and into a crevasse. He didn't fall too far, but he had sustained injuries. His Sherpa didn't know how to help other than to leave him there and seek help. So Lakpa struggled and eventually got to Camp 4, but he was too exhausted to shout for help. And by the time Lakpa was found there, he had collapsed and had severe frostbite. Those who found him couldn't get any information about Ravi from him, but his solo climb down indicated something. Ravi's life was in danger. They began to search for Ravi, but after looking for 24 hours, they began to lose that hope. Falling down at high altitude meant not just frostbite, but a possibility of injury or infection. Still, they silently prayed that somehow Ravi was waiting for help to arrive. I can't help but wonder what was happening to him. Was he awake and well aware of his injuries? His injuries that probably hurt 100 times more at that altitude? Did he wonder and hope that someone would come for him? Or did he accept his fate once he fell? Sadly, by the time they found Ravi, he had passed away from the injuries he sustained. I try to imagine if he felt fulfilled as he lay in the crevasse, waiting for death or help. Do you think his short life was spent well fighting for social justice? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. I think these 3 stories tell tales of sheer determination. Every one of them had their reason to climb, and they knew the risks they were taking. The West Bengal team had tried and didn't even get their chance twice. All they wanted was to show that they could do it. But sadly, their dependence on Sherpas cost them the only thing they had left, their lives. Joshua's risk as reward mindset led him through all his victories and eventually to death. And Ravi, his determination to prove that his caste was as good as any other, led him to climb the highest peak in the world. Yes, maybe if they had listened to their Sherpas, they would have lived another day. But for these people, living was not about just being alive. It was about sacrifice and fulfillment. I think these stories are heroic and full of passion. Let me know what you think about them.
Imagine sitting on a 40-degree slope of solid ice at 28,700 feet. The sun has disappeared. A screaming blizzard is rolling in, and you have absolutely no emergency gear. Your climbing partner is coughing up blood next to you, completely paralyzed by fluid filling his lungs. You still have a small window to stand up and crawl down the mountain to save yourself. You are not supposed to be here. Everyone else has already left you. In 1996, Pasang Sherpa faced this. What happened next is one of the most disturbing things I have found in years of covering this mountain. From a mother stranded in the freezing dark being forced to make a devastating choice, to a $50,000 corporate stunt that turned into a deadly game of every man for himself, to a desperate standoff at 28,000 feet. These are the 6 worst Sherpa deaths in Everest history. And I'm going to take you from bad to worse, because nothing could prepare you for the last one, because it proves exactly what happens when the very government meant to protect a climber decides to extort them instead. Late afternoon on May 14th, 2018, Lam Babu Sherpa found himself in a desperate situation he shouldn't have been in. At 45, with 3 previous Everest summits under his belt, he knew every inch of the ice he was standing on. But right now, all that experience didn't matter, because Lam was quite literally in an almost impossible state in the death zone, where your lungs are fighting for a third of their normal oxygen. His survival completely depended on the people he was with, and that was the problem, because ahead of him, 3 Ukrainian men were quickly moving down to safety without looking back at Lam and his younger fellow guide, Mingma Sherpa. Their names were Taras Pozny, Dmitry Semerenko, and Roman Gorodetsky, and they were the clients he just guided to the summit. They were social media entrepreneurs who had come to bury a hardware wallet containing $50,000 of cryptocurrency on Everest's summit on behalf of their company, Ask FM. You probably remember Ask FM. If you don't, it was a viral app where people asked strangers anonymous questions. But in 2018, the company caught the crypto bug. This climb was part of a promotion stunt to show their token was at the closest starting point to the moon. Now, Taras and Dmitry were actual mountaineers, but their partner, Roman, was more suited to analyzing trading charts than fighting their way up the top of the tallest mountain in the world. Regardless, getting them to the top meant moving extra camera gear, heavy equipment, and oxygen to keep them alive in the death zone. And the math on that is brutal. Someone has to carry all that weight. Despite that, they had only 2 Sherpas for the final summit push. Just Lam, Babu, and Mingma. To make things worse, Lam was the more experienced Sherpa here, which meant all through that summit push, he had been doing the heavy lifting. Not necessarily literally, but the heavy lifting of the technical logistics. He was the anchor holding a chaotic, grossly understaffed summit bid together. Against all odds, Sherpa Lam Babu got them to the summit.
The weather not very good, but I have 2 leather pockets.
They stood on top of the world, filmed their promotional video with the snow falling around them, and buried their crypto wallet. What could go wrong now? Well, everything. Because the summit is only the halfway point. Almost immediately after they began to come down, the weather collapsed. An unexpected snowstorm hit Everest's slopes, so the climbers had to get down fast. And on the descent, the sheer physical toll of the climb finally caught up with Lam Babu. The intense ultraviolet light bouncing off the ice had burned his eyes, and he was hit by snow blindness. It's a temporary condition at sea level, but imagine staggering completely blind at 26,000 feet in a freezing storm. What do you think your chances of survival look like? Naturally, you would expect the 3 men he just dragged to the summit would help him down. I mean, it's only logical you make sure the guy who just hauled your publicity stunt to the roof of the world makes it back down with you, right? Well, that was not what these climbers did. In the chaos of the storm, the team split apart, and the 3 Ukrainians began rushing down toward the relative safety of the South Col and left the 2 Sherpas. Now, let me be the devil's advocate for just 30 seconds. The death zone is a terrifying place. When a storm rolls in at 26,000 feet, sheer panic takes over. People make split-second decisions just to survive. Survival instinct kicks in, and people just think of themselves and nobody else. But on their way down, they actually encountered a lone Chinese climber named Saber Liu. He was stranded and completely out of oxygen. They stopped to help him and spent their limited energy saving a total stranger, which is heartwarming but strange at the same time, because they did not stop for their own guide. When they got to the safety of their camps, there was no attempt to confirm by Dmitry and the others if he made it down safely. I honestly don't know why. Maybe they just had no energy left in them anymore, but had enough to help a complete stranger, or maybe they just assumed things would work themselves out miraculously, but they didn't. Sherpa Lam Babu froze to death up there, alone and wandering completely blind somewhere in the dark above the South Col. He left behind a wife and 2 children. As for Mingma, the younger Sherpa guide, he miraculously managed to fight his way through the screaming blizzard and make it down to the lower camps entirely on his own. But the reality of Everest commercial climbing for Sherpas is that speaking out against clients, even if they abandon you, can get you blacklisted and cost you your livelihood. So Mingma disappeared from the public eye after his ordeal. Meanwhile, the influencers safely climbed back down to sea level, flew back to Kathmandu, and the celebration was in full swing. They started posting pictures of their frostbitten hands on Facebook, soaking in the likes and the comments. Their company, Ask FM, published triumphant statements boasting about their ideological superiority. To them, the stunt was a massive success because they had conquered the mountain. There was just one teeny tiny problem with their victory lap. The mountaineering community is small, and Sherpas don't just vanish without people noticing. Almost immediately, respected Everest chroniclers like Alan Arnett and other journalists started poking holes in their story by asking a very simple, very uncomfortable question. How does a 45-year-old Everest veteran develop snow blindness, start staggering around, and just get left behind by his own clients? And if these 3 guys had the time and energy to save a Chinese climber they had never met, how exactly did they lose their own head guide? The pressure on Ask FM mounted. So naturally, the company had to say something. Their CEO released a statement that was a masterpiece of corporate evasion. He claimed that over 100 Sherpas had worked on the expedition, and that Lam Babu was just one of many guides who had assisted them, amongst others, before he simply went missing during the descent, assisting other non-related groups. Think about how absurd that phrasing is. He didn't freeze to death because they abandoned him, he just went missing. Corporate speak for not my problem. But that's not even the worst part. When reporters finally cornered the influencers and asked them what exactly happened up there, Dmitry Semerenko didn't hide behind a PR team. He told reporters that Lam Babu looked inexperienced. He complained that the Sherpas barely understood English and were basically just porters. And then he justified leaving his guide behind with this exact quote: "The death zone starts at 27,000 feet. It's every man for himself zone." A guy on his very first Everest expedition looked at a man who had summited Everest 3 times and decided he was expendable. Dmitry used the terrifying reality of the death zone as a get-out-of-jail-free card. For tourists like him, the second the weather turns at 26,000 feet, the only currency that matters is their own survival. But for the Sherpas who actually build the road to the top of the world, abandoning a partner is unthinkable. And if you want to see exactly what that kind of absolute, unbreakable loyalty looks like, you only have to look at what happened to Nawang Sherpa on May 22nd, 2024. Nawang was a 44-year-old Sherpa from a village in Solukhumbu, Nepal. And although he had spent his life guiding climbers up other challenging peaks, he had never summited Everest before. On the night of May 21st, 2024, he clipped into the fixed line at the South Col and began moving upward into the dark behind his client, a Kenyan banker named Joshua Cheruiyot Kirui. Joshua had hired him for something that literally no one had ever done before. He wanted to be the first African to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. It's a tall order for sure, but Joshua was an award-winning ultra runner and a multiple-time mountain climber. He had even survived 2 bouts of high-altitude pulmonary edema on Manaslu the year before, so he knew the risk. And, just in case things went wrong up there, he told Nawang to carry an emergency oxygen bottle in case he went, in his words, lights out or bananas. The 2 men moved through the night past the balcony at 26,000 feet and up into heights where the rules of every mountain below stop applying, and the only currency that matters is how much your body has left. In the early hours before dawn, Nawang radioed base camp from a spot called Bishop Rock, about 130 feet below the summit. With a voice trembling with fear, he told them his client was strangely aggressive and simply wasn't cooperating anymore. Joshua refused to climb up and wouldn't go down either. These are the classic signs of severe high-altitude sickness. It's a Sherpa's nightmare, and it had just hit Nawang on his very first Everest summit guide attempt. To make things worse, Joshua was also aggressively refusing to use the emergency oxygen Nawang had carried all the way up for him. Nawang asked what to do. Base camp told him to keep trying to convince his client because, while a client can walk away, leaving behind his guide in times of danger, a Sherpa cannot without facing devastating consequences. You lose your livelihood, you get blacklisted by the major expedition companies, you face intense negligence inquiries from the government back in Kathmandu. So, for 2 hours, in the death zone, and at temperatures that kill exposed skin in minutes, Nawang stayed and kept trying to reason with a man who could not go up and would not come down. He kept radioing asking for instructions, and base camp kept telling him to persuade. Sometime that morning, the radio went silent. A few hours later, a British climber named John Mills was descending from the summit, and he stumbled upon a horrific scene. Joshua was upside down in the snow, groaning. His gloves were off, his hood was down, his climbing suit was wide open to the freezing wind. He was dying, and sitting next to him was Nawang Sherpa, just sitting in the snow with his eyes wide open, completely unresponsive, like he was in a trance. What had happened to Nawang was clearly the consequence of sitting still at 28,900 feet. Without physical exertion to generate heat, severe hypothermia had frozen his core. Combined with hypoxia, starving his brain of oxygen, his central nervous system had shut down. He had slipped into a coma right there and then, sitting upright. John shouted directly into Nawang's face. He got absolutely no reaction. Together with his Sherpa, John assessed the situation and realized they would die themselves if they lingered to drag 2 unresponsive men down the ridge, so they made the only choice they had left. They kept moving down, and when they reached safety, immediately alerted rescue teams to the situation up there. When the rescue teams eventually reached the site hours later, they found Joshua's body 70 feet below the summit. They never found Nawang. Rescuers think he fell down the mountain face. When people started to really dig in on what happened up there, a terrifying piece of information came to light. Joshua Kirui knew exactly how dangerous a no-oxygen summit was. To mitigate that massive risk, he explicitly paid his climbing agency, 7 Summit Treks, for the climbing services of a veteran Sherpa who had summited Everest 5 times. But for reasons that are still unknown, they assigned Nawang instead. Now, nobody questions Nawang's absolute bravery. I mean, he literally froze to death, refusing to abandon his client. But assigning a guide with 0 Everest experience to manage a high-risk, no-oxygen client is a recipe for disaster. And when things spiraled out of control, Nawang did the only thing he could. He radioed base camp and deferred to his superiors. In Nepali culture, there's a deeply ingrained, unbreakable respect for elders and authority figures. You don't argue with the veterans. So, when the experienced managers at the bottom of the mountain told this inexperienced guide to stay put and keep trying to persuade his dying client, Nawang did just that. He simply obeyed his elders to the literal end. Nawang was put in an impossible situation by the very commercial machine meant to manage the climb. But if you think the mountain punishing a guide for doing exactly what he was told is brutal, wait until you see how the industry treats the ones who dare to try to survive. On the morning of September 25th, 1996, a 25-year-old Sherpa named Lopsang Jangbu unzipped his tent and began moving up the Lhotse face, a massive 40-degree wall of steep ice. He shouldn't even have been on the mountain that day, because just months earlier, Lobsang was in the middle of the deadliest incident the mountain had ever seen at the time. He was hired as lead Sherpa during an American commercial expedition in May of the same year, which had ended in a disaster that resulted in 8 deaths. You probably have seen this picture before. You might even know some of their names. When these Western guides and clients died in the spring of 1996, the world stopped. It became a permanent piece of global news, and rightfully so. But what about Lobsang, who survived the impossible and risked his life trying to rescue his lead guide? Any other job would have given you time off. Heck, if you survive something like that as a Western client, you don't even need to climb anymore. Just go home, process your injuries, and write international bestsellers about what happened. But Lobsang didn't have the luxury of processing trauma. For a Sherpa, surviving a disaster is just a Tuesday. You go back to work the next day. The Everest commercial machine still needed labor. On top of that, he was blamed for the 1996 disaster. So what happened 4 months after was just the brutal way the mountaineering world decided to punish him. On September 25th, 1996, after crawling out of the worst day of his life, Lobsang packed his bags, walked right back into the death zone, working as a guide for Japanese climbers seeking to reach Everest's summit that fall season. His job that morning was doing the exhausting task of breaking trail. That means violently kicking his boots into deep, untouched snow, step after step, draining his own energy so the paying clients behind him could walk up a pre-made staircase. What Lobsang didn't know was that high-altitude winds had laid a trap on the Lhotse face. They had packed fresh snow into a dense, heavy top layer resting directly on older, weaker ice crystals. Climbers call it a wind slab. To Lobsang, looking up, it just looked like a pristine, solid ramp of white snow. But the bond holding that heavy top layer to the mountain was practically non-existent. As Lobsang, a French climber, and another Sherpa pushed up the steep slope, kicking their boots into the wall, their combined weight stressed the snow. Somewhere deep under their feet, that weak bottom layer finally gave out. There was no rumble, no shifting ice to warn them. The ground simply detached. In a fraction of a second, millions of pounds of heavy snow swept Lobsang off his feet, and he fell down Lhotse face, thousands of feet into the freezing valley below. His body was never recovered. But the story didn't end there. What makes Sherpa Lobsang's story so sad to me is the absolute silence that followed his demise. Unlike the noise that followed his survival 4 months earlier, the world barely blinked. There were no best-selling books written for Lobsang Jangbu. Unlike the deaths of the 8 climbers in May, his death wasn't global news. It was more of back-page news. The Everest machine extracted his labor, capitalized on the disaster he survived, and completely ignored him, and kept right on moving. I cover Lobsang's story in another video, which you'll find in the description. But if Lobsang's death proves that Everest treats its workers as expendable, you might assume that reaching the absolute pinnacle of the sport would buy you some kind of immunity. Surely if you become the undisputed king of the mountain, Everest cuts you some slack, right? Not even close. On the afternoon of April 29th, 2001, Babu Chiri Sherpa stuck his head into his Surdar's tent at Camp 2 and said, "Hey Lama, Boka Lama, get up. Let's go make some tea in the kitchen tent." His Serdar, a man nicknamed Boka Lama, rolled over and said no. As Babu left, Boka Lama noticed one thing. Babu wasn't wearing crampons. But he didn't put it to mind, because while Sherpas do not rank themselves, if anyone had any claim to being Everest's greatest Sherpa, it would be Babu Chiri Sherpa. For one, he had summited Everest 10 times. 10! He held the record at the time of having the fastest climb from base camp to the summit in 16 hours and 56 minutes. This man spent 21 straight hours on the summit without supplemental oxygen. He had never lost a single client. This was his 11th Everest expedition. Before leaving, he had finished building a school in his home village of Taksindu. It was his life's dream, because he himself had never attended a single day of school. He just needed to get through this season and go home to see it. That afternoon, he wasn't planning to go far. He told the others he was going to take some photographs. He walked out onto the glacier, maybe 300 feet from camp, into the fresh snow that had covered everything overnight. But at 5 p.m. that evening, when climbers emerged for snacks, Babu's tent was empty. By 9 p.m., his brother Dawa could not find him anywhere in camp. A search party assembled immediately after dark. They moved slowly across the fresh snow, sweeping their lights across a surface that looked perfectly flat and perfectly safe in every direction. Just before midnight, their lights picked up a trail of footprints leading to a small, dark hole in the snow. It was very narrow, maybe 5 feet across, and almost invisible if you weren't particularly looking for it. When the search looked deeper inside, they found what they had greatly feared. It was Babu Chiri's body. It took 60 Sherpas 8 hours to bring him out and down. Nobody knows exactly what happened out there. The official theory is that he went out to take photographs, maybe make that tea, and just fell into the small, unnoticeable crack. And the greatest high-altitude climber of his generation, a man who had survived the death zone more times than anyone could count and slept on the summit without oxygen, was just gone, just like that. He left behind a wife and 6 daughters. Boka Lama never stopped thinking about that afternoon. Years later, he said, "I still see Babu Chiri in my dreams sometimes. If I had agreed to go with him to the kitchen, half the records on Everest would be in his name." Everest has a dark way of collecting the people who know it best. And if you want the absolute, ultimate proof of that, you only need to look at our next story. Every spring, before any commercial team would set foot on Everest, a small crew of 6 to 8 Sherpas would move into the Khumbu Icefall and begin the most thankless job in mountaineering, building the road to Everest's summit. They were called the Icefall Doctors, and while they don't exactly wear white coats and carry around stethoscopes, their actions literally save lives. Their job is to find a path through the collapsing glaciers and regions of unsafe ice by drilling heavy anchors into the ice and stringing ladders over crevasses so climbers can safely walk to the top of the world. Securing this route sometimes means spending weeks inside the belly of an active glacier under towers of ice that can snap without warning. The physical cost is brutal. Despite the danger, the Icefall Doctors are the absolute best at what they do. In fact, for over 30 years since the group was formed, not a single doctor had ever died on the job. So on the morning of April 7th, 2013, death was the last thing on Mingma Sherpa's mind. A different Mingma Sherpa from the one who survived Ask FM's stunt. This 45-year-old Sherpa from the village of Gora Topting in Solukhumbu had been an icefall doctor for 9 years. He knew the Khumbu Icefall the way a surgeon knows the inside of a chest cavity. By March 2013, Mingma and the other ice doctors assembled because it was time to do what they always did. And by early April 2013, they were practically done. The team had fixed a route of lines and ladders from base camp all the way to Camp 2, just below the Lhotse face. To get home, all Mingma had to do was walk down the exact path he had just built. So, around 11:30 in the morning on April 7th, as Mingma was descending through the western Qim, this massive and notoriously dangerous area just below Camp 2, getting home was the only thing on his mind. He was heading back to the village of Dingbosch. He had a wife named Furdiki and 3 young daughters waiting for him. The problem is, the western Qim is a massive bowl of white ice, heavily scarred by massive cracks. High-altitude winds constantly blow loose snow across the gaps. Over time, that snow freezes into a thin crust spanning the void. Climbers call them snow bridges. To the naked eye, a snow bridge looks exactly like the rest of the solid, flat valley floor. In the freezing dark of the early morning, a snow bridge is rock solid. It will easily hold the weight of a Sherpa hauling heavy gear. Ming-Ma had likely walked over dozens of them on his way up, but Ming-Ma was descending at 11:30 in the morning. At that time, when the mid-morning sun hits the valley, frozen ice crusts that cover cracks in the glacier begin to warm and thin out from the bottom up. Ming-Ma stepped onto a patch of flat, white snow. It was probably the exact same snow bridge that had supported his weight hours earlier, but the mid-morning heat had critically weakened the structure. The moment he transferred his weight onto his boot, the thin crust shattered. The ground just vanished beneath him. He dropped straight through the floor and fell straight down. And a glacier crack has this weird shape where they're wide at the top but narrow down into a tight V shape at the bottom. So that meant Ming-Ma plunged 150 feet into the pitch black dark until he was wedged tight in the crushing ice. The harder he fell, the tighter the glacier locked around his body. His team immediately rushed to the edge, but because Ming-Ma was trapped so deeply inside that V-shape, pulling him straight up was nearly impossible. It took his fellow doctors several hours of rigging rope systems and hauling just to drag him back to the surface. By then, it was too late. Ming-Ma had passed, and so had the Icefall Doctor's perfect 30-year safety record with him. His crew had to leave his body at Camp 1 overnight until a helicopter could finally reach him the next morning. He left behind his wife and those 3 daughters. And again, the Everest commercial machine kept moving. The remaining doctors went right back out into the ice, fixed the broken lines, and 254 paying tourists summited that season. Because of how the expedition insurance was legally structured in 2013, the compensation for a Sherpa dying on the mountain was strictly capped. Ming-Ma's family received a payout of roughly 600,000 Nepali rupees. That is exactly $6,877. A commercial client will gladly pay $100,000 for a permit to safely walk across an aluminum ladder. The man who actually risks his life to build that ladder is valued at less than $7,000. That's what the industry decided a Sherpa's life costs. But the story I'm about to tell you isn't about what the industry decided. It's about what the government decided. And the number they put on a Nepali woman's dream is somehow inexplicably worse. On the morning of April 22nd, 1993, 32-year-old Pasang Lamu Sherpa was violently kicking her boots into the final icy stretch of the Hillary Step. She was pushing through the death zone, fighting the thin air at 28,000 feet. She was climbing with 4 male Sherpas and carrying almost nothing. No radio, no sleeping bags, no bivouac kit, no support team waiting below. If anything went wrong up there, the 5 of them were completely on their own. That was the only way they could do this. For years, the international climbing community and foreign expedition leaders had actively dismissed her. In 1990, she was climbing with a French expedition when the famous lead climber, Marc Bitard, literally ordered her to turn around. He refused to let her summit, essentially deciding that a Sherpa woman didn't belong at the top. A few years later, an Indian women's expedition sidelined her, refusing to give her a leadership role. Foreign climbers treated her as expendable labor, while her own male-dominated Sherpa culture told her a woman's place was at home. She was denied permits, blocked from teams, and pushed to the sidelines. Pasang Lamu Sherpa was the only daughter in a Sherpa mountaineering family. While her 3 brothers went to school, she stayed home to learn domestic work. At 17, she eloped with a man named Lakpa Sonam Sherpa to escape an arranged marriage, and together, they built one of the first Sherpa-owned trekking companies in Kathmandu. By 1993, she was a mother of 3 and had summited multiple peaks like Mont Blanc, Cho'oyu, and more, all except Everest. Even though her previous Everest summit attempts had failed, she was determined to reach the top of the world no matter what. Since she was competing with foreign expedition leaders who wouldn't even consider hiring her, she decided to go for it herself. But when she went to her own government to secure the permit, the authorities hit her with a massive roadblock. To climb Everest in 1993, the Nepalese government charged a $10,000 royalty fee. Because Pasang's team was made entirely of Nepali citizens climbing their own country's mountain, she petitioned the Ministry of Tourism to waive the massive fee. They refused. To pay the massive government fees and fund the climb, Pasang and her husband literally had to sell 60% of their own trekking company. They risked everything they had built from scratch just to force her way onto the mountain. Some might say they invested it. And on that afternoon of April 22nd, it finally worked. Pasang stood on the roof of the world. She made history, becoming the very first Nepali woman to summit Mount Everest. It was an incredible achievement after everything that she went through. But, as you know by now, the summit is only the halfway point. On their way down, her climbing partner, a 5-time Everest veteran named Sonam Sharing, suddenly collapsed in the snow and began coughing up blood. He had been struck by severe, high-altitude pulmonary edema. His lungs were literally filling with fluid, and he couldn't take another step. Pasang and the male Sherpas rushed to his side. They wedged their shoulders tightly under his armpits, acting as human crutches to physically bear his weight, just so his heavy boots would stay in contact with the ice. They rigged a short rope, desperately clipping a line between his harness and theirs to catch his dead weight every time his knees buckled. What followed was an agonizing, slow-motion battle for inches. They would physically push Sonam into dragging one sluggish, heavy boot forward. Then, the entire team would immediately have to stop, bracing him tightly as his body convulsed, gasping for the non-existent air, and coughing up pink fluid into the pristine white snow. 1 hour bled into 2, then 3, then 5. The sheer physical effort of holding him upright was draining Pasang and the others of their own rapidly depleting energy, step by agonizing step, until they finally managed to coax him down to the small, exposed plateau of the south summit at 28,900 feet. But by the time they got there, it was already late afternoon. The sun was dropping below the horizon, and 2 of the male Sherpas looked at the reality of the situation. If they stayed on that ridge with a dying man, they were going to freeze to death. So they made the brutal, mathematical choice to save themselves. They pushed ahead, feeling their way down the mountain in the dark, and successfully escaped to Camp 4. That left only 3 people stranded on the south summit as the night set in: Pasang, a Sherpa named Pemba Norbu, and the dying Sonam. Pasang had to make a horrible choice. The math of survival in the death zone pretty much dictates that you cannot put a dying man on your shoulders at 28,000 feet. And you cannot stop moving as well, because if you stay still for too long, your core temperature falls and almost never gets back up again. Just like what happened to Nawang Sherpa. Now, here's the thing. Every month I make one video just for Patreon. The warnings were there. You won't see it anywhere else. If that's your kind of thing, links in the description. To survive, Pasang and Pemba had to do what Dimitri did: turn their backs and leave Sonam in the snow. But they simply didn't do that. Instead of climbing down to the relative safety of Camp 4, they sat down in the snow next to Sonam. Because they had packed so light, they had no sleeping bags and no tent. And worst of all, their bottled oxygen had just run completely dry. So for the entire night, the 3 of them were forced to just sit in the snow, exposed to the freezing wind, waiting for a sun that was hours away. When the sun finally rose on the horizon the next morning, The damage was done. Sonam was completely frozen. He couldn't even get to his feet. Pemba Norbu realized they were out of time. If they all stayed sitting there, all three of them would die. So, Pemba also reluctantly made the call to leave them behind, climbed down to Camp 4 alone, and tried to send them fresh oxygen bottles for a rescue. Pasang actually tried to follow Pemba down. She forced herself to stand up, but her body was so crippled by the lack of oxygen and the freezing night that she immediately collapsed back into the snow. But she wasn't paralyzed. She still had a closing window to save herself. She could have dragged herself down the ridge. She could have crawled. What Pasang chose to do next is the reason thousands of strangers lined the streets of Kathmandu to say goodbye to a woman most of the world had never heard of. Instead of fighting her way down to the relative safety of Camp 4, she stopped trying to descend. She reached over to Sonam's canvas backpack. She emptied it out, wrapped the thin canvas around her legs to block the wind, and sat right back down in the snow on that 40-degree slope. She sat next to her dying partner, with nothing but the clothes on her back to keep him company while they waited for a rescue that would come far too late. Pasang Sherpa froze to death up there, leaving behind her husband and those 3 young children. Her body was brought down, and she was laid out in a stadium in Kathmandu. Thousands came to see her. The funeral procession at Swayambhu drew crowds that filled the streets. The king of Nepal awarded her the Nepal Tara, the country's highest honor. Pasang Lambu Sherpa's story is the ultimate testament to a guide's loyalty. She surrendered her own chance at survival just so her climbing partner wouldn't have to freeze to death alone. It is a beautiful, heartbreaking sacrifice. But that exact same loyalty forces us to look at a much darker, far more frustrating side of the Everest machine. Because if a Sherpa is willing to risk absolutely everything to keep you alive, what does it take to look your guide dead in the eye and completely ignore them? On May 21st, 2016, 4 exhausted climbers stood just 3,000 feet from Everest's summit when their Sherpa looked them dead in the eye and said, "Please, back." Here is what happened next.